The Escape Route, written by Rod Serling, performed by Scott MacDonald. He lay on the sweat-logged, soggy sheets, his ice-cube blue eyes, set deep in a bald bullet head, stared up at the cracked ceiling, his aching, middle-aged body pleading for sleep, but his mind, a runaway dynamo, racing back and forth across the bombed-out landscape of his life. And it had been a full life, and a rich one. Gruppenführer Joseph Strobe, former Deputy Assistant Commander of Auschwitz, former confidant of one Heinrich Himmler, former wearer of black, shiny boots, crisply pressed black uniforms, and former frequent maker of love in the back seat of his personal, chauffeur-driven Mercedes-Benz. It all came back to him then, lying on that sagging, lumpy mattress of a threadbare room, while the traffic noises seeped in through the open window, riding on a soft sigh of wind from the distant Andes. Other noises, too. Distant music from the Teatro Colón, the opera house, a taxi horn, and a distant shrill siren, a woman's laugh, a garbled argument. Buenes Aires at night, the torpid, sluggish heat noises of a hot country, of a people who grew bananas and shook castanets and ate garlic. Former Gruppenführer Joseph Strobe found himself probing and digging into old graves of memory that beckoned back to the other time, to the exuberance and energy and vigor of a people, a nation, a purpose. He remembered the cheers, the deafening sounds of voices, the crowd noises. Germany had been a crowd. Life had been a rally, a continuous convocation that produced a rolling thunder of guttural screams sweeping across the sky over the vast auditorium of the Berlin Sports Palace, or the massive stadium at Nuremberg. 100,000, 200,000 people who would greet the Fuhrer, their mass adulation like a mammoth surf breaking against the sky, echoing back in thundering waves. Oh God, he missed them, those sounds, those voices. He missed the roaring reverberation of that Third Reich, and he missed standing there on a platform, black uniformed and young, booted and breveted, impervious and indestructible. But it was all past tense, all former, and his regrets were formless wraiths crawling into his mind, dirtying up the clean order of his memories. For Gruppenführer Strobe's life had not the benefit of the Valkyrian finale. It did not end as it was supposed to have ended, gloriously and cataclysmically in one earth-shattering moment of Götterdämmerung. Rather, it had ground to a stop in spasmodic little agonies. It had flaked off in bits and pieces, like the flotsam of a refugee column casting off sad little remnants on a road to defeat. Death had sent out its feelers, its hints very early in the game. At El Alamein, and then at Stalingrad, Sicily, and then Salerno. And after that, death became a part of Germany, and a part of a daily process. Some of it showed itself when the patrols of the U.S. 69th met the forward elements of the Russian 58th Guards Division at Torgau on the Elbe. That was on April 25th, 1945. It was the next day that Strobe buried his black uniform in a field 2 miles from Dachau. Death stage number 2 took place on the Czechoslovakian border when he shaved off his small black mustache and obliterated his SS tattoo with acid. An hour before, he had found the bodies of 2 SS men captured by partisans. They mutilated his SS tattoo with acid. An hour before, He had found torn mouths still open in a protest that they had simply followed orders. And death had continued, a long and protracted funeral, with no eulogies and no mourners. Strobe had gone to Prague and spent 6 months there eating garbage in the upstairs room of a bombed-out factory, hiding in a sewer at night. Then he had shipped out as a stoker on a leaky freighter to South America. He had not known the other German crew members, but he had recognized them as blood brothers. They wore dungarees as if they were a uniform. Their backs were ramrod straight, their lips thin and hating, their muscles firm and toned from the calisthenics of killing. In his eyes and theirs, haunting and unaccustomed fears flitted past, but the eyes rarely showed surrender and never showed guilt. The Third Reich had died in a whimpering denial, but a handful of its more elite Boy Scouts remained alive. A few errant wiggling fingers of a corpus delicti, breathing and walking and sighing with a wistful nostalgia for the new order, now the old order, now the dead order. Strobe had been a year in Brazil, working in a steel mill, a month hiding in Caracas, then 5 years later, after a dozen name changes, he had found asylum in Buenos Aires, where the track record of the Third Reich and the judgments of Nuremberg seemed of little consequence, and where, in the Argentine government itself, there seemed to be an informing touch of not a few Nazi values. It was here that he picked up his name again. To be called Strobe once more was a gesture of a certain defiance, a little like putting on a swastika brassard and saying, "So do something." He also found a job. The former Mercedes-Benz owner drove a delivery truck in the daytime and drank beer at night and watched the years peel away, dimming the recollection of the past glory. Until, one day, it happened. He had heard it on the radio. Eichmann. Neutral and quiet and matter-of-fact, a radio announcer reading the news. One Adolph Eichmann had been picked up by the Israeli Secret Service. It was an official announcement from the Israeli government. The prisoner was already, at that moment, en route to Tel Aviv. The plane carrying him had left the Buenos Aires aerodrome 2 hours before. It had not been a pronouncement with rolling drums or significant trumpet blasts. It had been simply a news item, and there had followed the soccer scores and the weather report. Adolph Eichmann was en route to Israel for atonement, but Buenos Aires had defeated Caracas 5-3, and there had been a fire on the Paseo Colón and a large religious ceremony held in Aconcagua in the Andes. And incidentally, quite incidentally, a man whose real name was Adolph Eichmann, who had been tried in absentia, was no longer in absentia. It had meant little to the castanet players and the banana growers and the garlic eaters, but to Joseph Strobe it had meant much. Someone had torn open the grave and was disinterring the bodies. The flesh had decomposed, but not the sloganry that were the epitaphs. Crimes against humanity, 6 million Jews, murder factories. Joseph Strobe and men like him had stopped their running and stopped their hiding and stopped the ritual track covering. From the Caribbean to the Urals, they had planted new roots, assumed new identities, manufactured new lives. They had done all this confident that there was a statute of limitations by which even a 10-year horror might be swallowed up to disappear into the gullet of a frantic and ever-changing history. Ghosts had come back to former Gruppenführer Strobe at that moment. They had run past him like a mob on a dark street. They had whispered into his ear, Eichmann. They had taken Eichmann, and Eichmann had hidden too, and had changed his name, and had married, and had a family. 15 years had gone by, but the Israelis had simply waited, watched and waited. A patient breed, the Jew. An incredibly patient breed. For a week after the announcement of the apprehension of Eichmann, Strobe had clung desperately to the pattern of his living. He had gone to work and come home from work. He had eaten his meals and drunk his beer and had sought out no shadows or new anonymity. And when a certain frightened portion of his mind had sent out impulses of phobia, he had kept up a running monologue. Eichmann, of course. He had been number 2 man to Martin Bormann, who in turn had been at the right arm of the Führer. Certainly they would take Eichmann, but Strobe, laugh and reject. He had been a lousy Gruppenführer, an unknown, a small potato. To work, and back home again, embracing the normality of his existence, clutching at it, as if by denying this new jeopardy, he could prove that it did not exist. Meals and beer drinking, and the running monologue to assuage the apprehensions that squatted like lead-heavy gargoyles deep in his gut. Eat, Strobe, and drink your beer, Strobe, and think of it rationally. There are 100 men they'd seek out before your name came up. At least 100. Bormann. They'd dig tunnels into the earth's crust to get to Bormann. And what about Heinrich Müller? He was head of the Gestapo, now living in Russia. And what of Dr. Joseph Mengele? The good doctor had operated on 5,000 human beings, mangling them, scarring them, killing most of them. He was in Paraguay now, not very far away. They would certainly look for Mengele before even thinking of him. There were hundreds of others, hundreds, prizes, every one of them. Back to work, and home again. And the running monologue. Rationally now, Strobe. Rationally and coolly. Who are these shadowed hunters? These omniscient purveyors of belated and perverted justice? A handful of Jews, a dozen, maybe 24 Yids from a comic opera desert country 5,000 miles away. Izzy and Abby and Irving and Seymour, probably in leather coats like the Gestapo, and with wide-brimmed hats pulled down over their eyes. Play actors putting on the trappings of their tormentors. Play actors. But they had taken Eichmann. The continuing monologue. Strobe, old chap, they are Jews. They are the most predictable people on earth, the least subtle. My God, can you fear Jews? Can you fear a breed of sheep, Strobe, old chap? You watch them die, quiet and unprotesting, docile and resigned. 100 an hour. Into the gas vans, columns of 2s, men and women and children. This way to the extermination. This way. And don't jostle there. Keep intervals. The dying must be orderly. It must be according to mathematics. It must be efficient. This way to the showers, by the numbers. And they had died by the numbers, by incredible numbers, in multiples and multiples of multiples. Thousands and hundreds of thousands, and always unprotesting, never a voice raised, let alone an arm. Are these what you fear, Strobe? This species of born victim? Come, Strobe, drink your beer. But they had taken Eichmann. Strobe rose from the bed, the lumpy, sweat-smelling bed, and walked through the airless room to the dresser. He took a cigarette and lighted it, feeling his undershirt clinging to him as if glued there by some sticky, stinking substance. In the flare of the match, he looked at his reflection in the mirror and hated what he saw. The once smooth and unfurrowed face was now lined and creviced, the flesh under the eyes pouched and sagging, like purple hammocks left out in the weather. 15 years could diminish a man. They could take the youth out of his face and the maleness from his body. But even when the match had gone out, Strobe could still see his eyes staring back at him. He saw something in those eyes that had been born just a week ago, and he recognized it. He had seen it before when it was he who dispensed death with the wave of a riding crop or a nod of the head in a given direction. He had seen the look in other men, the naked animal expression of unutterable fear and languageless agony, fear that churned and bubbled and built up beyond the point where it could come out of pores or retreat into insanity or lie down in black unconsciousness. He had seen it in a Catholic priest in Auschwitz when they had crucified him on the parade ground. He had seen it on the face of a Jewish dentist from Berlin when they put the syringe of acid into his testicles. He had seen it in a Hungarian gypsy when they had blinded him with needles. The unspeakable terror that looked back at him with his own eyes was familiar. An old acquaintance had come back to visit. It perched there in the glass, unbidden and unwelcome, and reminded Strobe that the order of the universe had been turned upside down. The hunters had become the hunted. The victims were now dispensing the death. It was his certain knowledge of this which made him acknowledge to himself that his nightly monologues were ceremonial rites, venerating a special and personal immunity that he knew had no real existence. The tortured logic, the incessant self-reassuring, the clutching of the slenderest of straws, these were part of the ritual. But even while standing there, silently acknowledging his fear, Strobe was enough of a pragmatist to know that the acknowledgment was not enough. There was a next step. There was another chapter to follow this one, and this chapter had not yet been written. In his time, he had helped empty a world of its illusions, so he knew, again with a silent admission, that simply to hope or pray or wish was an illusory process in itself. Mercy was an illusion, compassion was another illusion, and salvation and safety were the most tenuous visions of all. When he walked back over to the bed and looked at the deep, still wet indentation his heavy body had made, it occurred to him that it looked like a grave. Here lies Joseph Wilhelm Strobe, age 47, height 5'9", cause of death. He had changed from a lion into a fox, while some children of Israel had made a transformation from sheep into hounds. He butted the cigarette out in an ashtray, and then looked around the sparse, deadly depressing room. No, he could not pray. He knew no language of supplication. He was an expert on death, both the dealing and the prevention. But in this soon-to-be next chapter of his life, which had begun just hours before, he must find new tools to a new trade. He must become an escaper of traps. He must learn all over again to be a survivor. The only illusion he had ever embraced was the past 15 years of his existence. This room, the delivery truck, his nightly beer drinking, all the things his pragmatic soul had accepted as reality, he now knew to be part of the dream. The 15 years had not been a haven. They had simply been a respite. The reality was outside in the night, outside in the shadows. The reality had leather coats and a black sedan and a list of names in a notebook. "The hell with it," Strobe said aloud. "The hell with it." And then a fresh new monologue. "So, Strobe, they possibly seek out you. Fine. Excellent. That means you were someone. That means you made a mark. You had a niche. You were important. Excellent. So this we have established. Now what do you do? Do you stay in this room and sweat away your flesh and feed on your nerves and pace back and forth like an animal in the zoo? Do you lie down on that stinking mattress and call it a casket? Come, Strobe, come, old chap. Head high and shoulders back. Go to the Rathskeller, drink some beer. Let the kikes know whom they're dealing with. Let them know this is Gruppenführer Strobe, who once carried a riding crop and would point it to the left and then to the right and say that this one dies and this one lives and this one dies and this one lives. You, Strobe, you did that. You put death into the sweep of a riding crop. So don't skulk in shadows in a shitty little furnace of a room. Go out and remind the bastards who it was who held the riding crop." "To hell with it," Strobe said again, and again aloud. He buttoned up his shirt and threw on his coat and went out the door. He would go to Lancer's Rathskeller now. There would be friends there, Germans like himself. There would be, what would you call it? A mutuality of interests. And then, smiling grimly, the company of misery, the oneness of fear. He walked out the front door and lighted another cigarette as he looked across the street at the Palacio del Congreso and its flood-lighted dome and statuary. It made the street bright and reminded him that from now on darkness was an enemy. The shadows were hostile ground, and to be alone. This was a condition that favored the hounds. He started down the sidewalk, filling his lungs with the cooler night air and feeling some of the tension dissipate. But he knew from this moment on, he was the fox. He was the hunted. 20 minutes later he arrived at Lancer's Rathskeller, a smoky cellar decorated with Japanese lanterns and filled with guitar music and guttural laughter. Germans like himself. There was Lancer behind the bar pouring a beer, laughing with a tall blonde woman sitting by herself at the far end of the bar. Imperishable Lancer, with his round idiotic face, his big blue eyes, and the remnant of blonde wavy hair, now whitened and diminishing, but always with the smile, the grin, the happy look. During the other time he had been a friend of Koch, a right arm, a handyman, and Koch had had lampshades made out of inmate skin and given them as a gift to his wife. And it was Koch who had killed all those thousands at Buchenwald. So Strobe found himself thinking, pour your beer and smile that goddamned gargoyle smile of yours, my friend Lancer. You are not out of the woods either. You are not out of the scent of those bloody Jewish hounds. He had started toward the bar when a voice stopped him. "Herr Strobe." Strobe stopped and looked toward the voice. He recognized him instantly. Gruber, tall and thin and very Prussian. He had once commanded a division, and then had been transferred to the Eisenstadt commandos under Ohlendorf. It was Ohlendorf who had masterminded the extermination of the Russian peasantry when they had first invaded the Soviet Union. And Gruber had been high-ranking and very important, decorated by the Führer personally. And when the old man rose from the table, it occurred to Strobe that he always stood straight and bowed from the waist and screwed up one of his eyes as if he were wearing a monocle, and clicked his heels in a military acknowledgment of a decoration just received. Gruber, the Prussian, a silent, taciturn, wary man who 15 years ago, and also on this very night, made Strobe uncomfortable. It was the same now as then. A disquieting little feeling of inferiority crept into Strobe, the same inferiority all Nazis had felt when in the presence of the old line staff men with the Vons in front of their names and the military genealogies that dated back to Frederick the Great. A gnawing unpleasantness that came with looking into the eyes of a man who knew himself to be superior and better bred, with finer blood, and a coat of arms, dusty now and put aside, but still a matter of record. Strobe automatically put out his hand, and Gruber shook it, then motioned for him to sit down. Strobe did so, stiffly, noting subconsciously that Gruber looked particularly old that night, and particularly tired. "I'm glad you showed up tonight," Gruber said in a soft voice. "I was hoping you would." He snapped his finger at a passing waiter and pointed to Strobe. A moment later, another waiter brought over a tray with mugs of beer. Gruber took one. "And some bourbon," Strobe said to the waiter. "Bring the bottle." As he said it, he looked at Gruber, who smiled at him. "A night to drink, eh, Herr Strobe?" The tall, thin man, who had once been a colonel general, leaned forward across the table. "But not a special occasion tonight, is it?" Strobe made a display of nonchalance with a flamboyant shrug. "What would be so special tonight?" The old man stared at him steadily. "We fence a little, don't we, Herr Strobe? We engage in a little duel, the two of us." "I don't know what you're talking about," Strobe muttered. Gruber smiled. "I'll tell you what I'm talking about." He lighted a cigarette, then put it into a holder. Again the affectation, Strobe thought. The non-existent monocle, and the cigarette holder and the bowing from the waist, just as if this were a parade ground and Gruber still had a division of troops waiting to be reviewed. "Herr Strobe," Gruber said very gently, "we all know what happened to Eichmann. It is also common knowledge that after Eichmann there will be others." He exhaled a thin stream of blue smoke, then wet his lips. "I am on the list, you know, Herr Strobe." "I didn't know," Strobe said. "Indeed," Gruber said. "I found out the day before yesterday. I have a brother-in-law who works at the Hotel Plaza del Rey on the desk. 2 men checked in there this past Monday, Swiss passports. But they could be anything. Their names could have been Swiss or possibly German." Strobe nodded impatiently. "One of the chambermaids, also German, found a collection of photographs that one of the men had left behind one morning after they went out. My picture was among them." "That doesn't prove a great deal," Strobe said, without conviction. He was saying the words, like sticking his toe in cold water to feel the temperature. Gruber smiled at him, a patient, condescending smile, as if explaining a lesson to a thick and unimaginative student. "It means," he said softly, "that the two men are, of course, not Swiss. They're very obviously Israeli. They are also here to collect a few of us as they collected Eichmann." The waiter brought a bottle of bourbon with 2 glasses. Strobe poured one, then looked expectantly at Gruber, who shook his head with a smiling, "No, thank you." Strobe took the shot glass and downed it, then immediately poured another. He looked up to see Gruber staring at him. "I'd finish the bottle if I were you," Gruber said. "Oh," Strobe answered, feeling cold. "You see, Herr Strobe, my photograph is obviously not being carried around South America because I have a pretty face or because I am being considered for a beauty contest." There was a pause, and then his soft voice grew pointed, like a barb. "Nor is yours." Strobe allowed himself the second drink, feeling its heat mix with the cold, and then being defeated by the cold. He felt actually icy now as his hand shook while he poured his third glass. "My picture," he heard himself saying, forcing an evenness into his tone, trying to smooth the words out like ironing pleats out of trousers, hating the shake and quiver of that icy fear that had taken hold. "My picture," he repeated. "Yours," said Gruber. "Your picture and mine and a few others. No one whom the chambermaid could recognize as living here except you and me." He very carefully took the cigarette out of its holder, pinched off the end, then laid both the holder and cigarette down on the table alongside of one another. Meticulous, thought Strobe. So goddamned meticulous. He lines everything up with such order and such symmetry. Even the words he throws out at you to announce your peril, these too are in a straight line, even and symmetrical. Again Strobe poured himself a drink, and this time sipped at it, not meeting the other man's eyes for a moment. Then, in as neutral and non-committal a tone as he could manage, he spoke as he met the other man's eyes. "Tell me, Herr Gruber, what do you intend to do about this?" It was Gruber's turn to shrug. "I have made certain arrangements, Herr Strobe. A relative in Uruguay, someone with certain connections. It will involve a passport alteration and some other manipulations, but it goes without saying that I must leave here." Strobe nodded in agreement. "And you, Herr Strobe," Gruber said, still smiling, "what will you do?" Strobe continued to sip at his bourbon, then put the glass down. "I shall wait it out, Herr Gruber. Wait a week or two, perhaps." "A bit of advice," Gruber said, sounding more like the Prussian colonel general. "I wouldn't wait too long. If I were you, I would begin ascertaining any and all available escape routes." The smile became thin and even more Prussian. "There are times when a tactical retreat is a sounder strategy than a prolonged reconnoitering of familiar ground." Their eyes met again, each man disliking the other. Strobe resenting Gruber's superiority. Gruber offended that this pig-faced man had once outranked him, so much like all those brown scum, stupid, bullish, cruel men who defiled everything traditional and who, Gruber thought for the 1000th time, took men like himself down in the pit with them, without any code, without any honor, and without a thought of consequence. They were always screaming about the Jews, but it was they who corrupted Germany. It was they who bled it and poisoned it and made it die. Again he stared at Strobe and felt a loathing rise up in him, like nausea. Why did the man have to sweat so? He found himself staring, fascinated, at the glistening wet dome and the slitted blue eyes that blinked so incessantly, the naked, fat face of the man, the sour smell of his fear. Yes, there was fear there, behind the thick, stolid flesh. Inside the big frame was a cavity, deep and decaying with the bile of rising panic. Strobe was afraid, and Gruber felt at least a modicum of satisfaction that this was one Nazi he could return the favor to. They had destroyed him. They had cut him to pieces. At least he could scratch back just this once. "You perspire rather freely, Herr Strobe," Gruber said, with a thin, hating smile. "Why do you sweat so? The place is not hot. No one else sweats." Strobe looked up at the cold, appraising dislike on Gruber's face, and his lips trembled. "My sweat bothers you, Herr Gruber. I'm so sorry. I'm truly very sorry. I offer you apologies for my sweat." Excellent, Gruber thought. He had reached him. But if only there was something more he could do to him, something to really bleed him. Again he looked him up and down, studying his face and hating him with a rich, open, satisfying, cathartic hate. This was what was left of Germany. The good men died, but this is what survived in the ashes. This bloated, brooding pig face with the sweating dome and the nervous eyes. But this was enough. This was quite enough. He leaned back in his chair, almost as if in a gesture of dismissal. "So the information is yours, Herr Strobe. I simply wanted you to know." Strobe rose to his feet, feeling his legs shaky, his head swimming slightly from the drinks. The white, dignified, thin-lipped face in front of him was slightly out of focus, and Strobe had difficulty putting Gruber's twin mask back into place so that there would be but one face. "May I say something to you, Herr Gruber?" Strobe said, smiling and swaying slightly. "You have been most frank and candid with me. May I reciprocate with an equal frankness?" He loved the way he spoke now. It was the liquor freeing him. It did this often. It gave him a new speech pattern, foreign to him but singularly impressive. "May I tell you, Herr Gruber, that in matters of retreat, I yield to your superior knowledge of that specific. It has been my experience over the years that in matters of running away, the General Staff was most expert, most consummately expert." Then it was Strobe's turn to note, with satisfaction, that he had struck home. Gruber's white face turned a shade more pale. He rose very slowly, his back stiff, ramrod stiff. He wanted to tell Strobe that what he just said, it was a reflection on his honor and the honor of the General Staff, and that he resented it. But he knew that such language, in a smoky Rathskeller in Argentina in the year 1960, was nonsense, garbage. So he simply stared at Strobe, forcing the other man to eventually turn his eyes away, and then he smiled, his thin Prussian smile. "Yes, Strobe," he said very softly, "do you know what you look like? May I tell you? You look like a white, quivering pig on its way to the slaughter. A white, quivering, protesting pig." Strobe felt his insides knot up. He slammed a fist down on the table, upsetting the bottle. "Why, you fucking aristocratic monocle wearer, you tell me what I look like, you piece of shit, you opinionated piece of shit." The room gradually became quiet. People turned to stare at Strobe. "Yes, Strobe," Gruber said quietly. "Your voice, please. You are being stared at and listened to. Attention is not exactly what you require at this moment." But Strobe had gone beyond logic or restraint. "You," he screamed out, "tell me what it is I require. You? I'll tell you, Mr. Aristocrat, Mr. General Staff, Mr. High-born Prussian swine. You can tell me nothing, understand? From you I need nothing, I require nothing, I ask for nothing. Only that you get the hell out of my sight." And as Strobe screamed and pounded and ranted, he was oblivious to everything but the contentment and the satisfaction that came with allowing his mind and mouth to explode, permitting his fear to come out in the form of anger. He did not even feel Lancer's hand pulling nervously on his coat sleeve, or see the warning in his frightened, idiotic smile and his pleading eyes as he whispered repeatedly, "Joseph, Joseph, please, please, Joseph. You're making a scene, Joseph." Throughout the onslaught, Gruber stood there, silently, rigidly, allowing his superiority to stand as an impassive wall against this frothing fury that pounded at him. And when Strobe had run out of words and out of breath, Gruber simply nodded and dropped his head a little, as if waiting for another beat for the last fragment of fury to spend itself. Then he looked back into Strobe's eyes. "Are you quite finished?" Gruber asked quietly. "I am finished," Strobe said, his voice shaking. "I am finished with you." "With me?" Gruber said, with a crooked smile. "My Herr Strobe, you never had any business with me. Not then, not now. We are linked together by an accident of nationality, but we are distinctly separate and distinctly different." Strobe sat back down, feeling the liquor, sluggish, heavy, and hot, running through him, muddling up his mind now so that his cleverness and his sageness were no longer available. "May I?" Gruber said softly, taking a step toward him. "Tell you the most fundamental difference that there is between us." Strobe's head felt too heavy for him. It wobbled from side to side, and a special exertion was needed to make it stop its movement. He blinked his eyes up at Gruber. "You may tell me any goddamn thing you want," he said. "The difference," Gruber continued, "is that if they find me, if they take me, and if they string me up some place in a hot Palestinian sun, I am sufficiently human to regret having my life end. But this difference between us, Herr Strobe, Herr Gruppenführer Strobe, I will die knowing that they are right and I have been wrong. Just that one single variation of view, that I can tell right from wrong. And how different that is from you, Herr Strobe, and your breed. Even now, even while you're being hunted down, you still do not know why. You still do not perceive that you are wrong and they are right. And it is this kind of ignorance, Herr Strobe, that lost you the war. It is this kind of ignorance that will eventually take your life. Then the old man clicked his heels and bowed slightly from the waist, a quick smile toward Lancer, who stood there transfixed, and then he walked very slowly, back straight, head high, to the door, and went out. Strobe felt Lancer's nervous hand patting his back. He twisted in the chair and pushed the hand away. Lancer, he said thickly, if you are handling me as a gesture of comfort, there is no need. If you are feeling the material of my coat, I'll tell you exactly where I bought it, and you can get one for yourself. Lancer blinked nervously, looked briefly around the room, then leaned over the table, his face close to Strobe's. Joseph, he said softly, no scene, please, not tonight, since the Eichmann thing. He shook his head, and his voice trailed off into nothing. He gave a nervous shrug. You understand, don't you, Joseph? Strobe noted that Lancer's face, too, had a twin mask, and then a second. He focused hard until all three faces joined as one, and then he reached for the bottle, missed it at first, then finding it, and poured himself another drink. He held up the glass. To you, my friend Lancer, Prost, he said. He finished the drink in a gulp and sat there staring at his hands. Across the room, a bent little man with a black patch over one eye limped slowly toward the restrooms carrying rolls of paper towels. Strobe saw his reflection in the bar mirror. The little man's name was Zamorsky, a feeble-minded Pole with little rivulets of scars that ran in crazy quilt patterns across his face. The one eye that gaped from the ruined face looked out blandly and cheerfully, but with no hint of any kind of understanding. Strobe stared at the disappointing reflection, and again felt the twinge of fear that was part of the night's pattern. Lancer, that stupid goddamned idiot, to keep a crazy Polish bastard around the place for people to see and not improbably sometimes to hear. He had been an inmate at Buchenwald, picked up across the Polish border in 1939, and Lancer, stupid and unimaginative Lancer, had been his special tutor. It had taken a year for Zamorsky's spirit to be pulled taut and then torn apart. Shortly thereafter, his mind had followed. For some incredible reason, he had attached himself to Lancer, following him, groveling like a pet dog, thankful if he were stroked occasionally, more thankful if he were not kicked or beaten. When Lancer had escaped from Germany, he had pointedly taken Zamorsky with him. This plodding, mindless, one-eyed ruin was his passport. The Russians never looked for SS men in company with their victims. And to Lancer, because he was a simple man, because he had few dreams and aspired to very little, Zamorsky was the reminder of better days. He kept the Pole around, just like a pet, never wondering, as Zamorsky himself appeared not to wonder, what incredible bond of life or death kept the simple-minded tormentor and the mad martyr together. Indeed, it apparently had never registered in the Pole's battered brain that this protector in the white apron, who smiled so continuously and who petted him, had once fed him salt herring for 3 days while chaining him, without water, to hot pipes in a furnace room. The look in the one eye that gaped foolishly about him was filled with nothing but admiration for his master. It also seemed never to have occurred to him that even now, 20 years later, the smell of tobacco awoke in him some nightmarish screaming fear. He had probably forgotten, too, that it was Lancer who'd shoved a burning cigarette in his other eye so many years before, during a lazy Saturday afternoon at Dachau, when Lancer, simple, unimaginative Lancer, had felt bored. Strobe shook his head and tried to push the recollection of Gruber out of his mind. The recollection of Gruber and the business of the photographs. He was not surprised. He had expected this, but still, to know for certain, to suddenly get a confirmation of his jeopardy came with a shock. He felt his nerves taut again, and that formless fear crawling through his body, and with it came an anger that it should be Gruber who made the pronouncement. Gruber, so happy about the damned thing, so pleased to be the chronicler of his doom. That son of a bitch, Gruber. Strobe let his eyes wander around the room, trying to find a target for his anger. He thought of the Pole, and then of Lancer. He rose from the table and walked slowly toward the bar where Lancer had resumed talking with the blonde. "Lancer?" Strobe said, motioning him to come over. Lancer warily walked behind the bar to stand opposite him. He had never cared for Strobe, not really. They had mutual friends and other things in common that went deeper than flesh. But there was something imponderable and unfathomable about the man. He was like a walking stick of dynamite, volatile and easily lighted. And in that thick-set frame was power, explosive power, blind, directionless, destructive power. Lancer's foolish smile came on as he took a bottle from behind him and put it in front of Strobe. "On your house, Joseph. Drink hearty, old friend." Strobe took the bottle, uncorked it, and put it to his lips, drinking fast and deep. He put the bottle down on the bar and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "You know something, Lancer?" Strobe said in his thick, guttural, drunken voice. "You take risks. Do you know that? You take bloody risks." "Risks?" Lancer said, the smile fixed. "Risks," answered Strobe. "Risks like the Pole." He nodded toward the restrooms where Zamorsky was just coming out, shuffling past the tables, smiling his sad, unknowing little smile. "You mean Zamorsky?" Lancer sounded surprised. "My little pet Zamorsky." Strobe took another drink. "Your little pet Zamorsky," he said. "Your little pet Zamorsky could put a rope around your neck. You're a stupid shit to keep him around, Lancer." Lancer gazed with special fondness toward the wreck and laughed softly. In some little compartment of his mind, he recalled the hours of fun he'd had with the Pole so many years ago. He half closed his eyes in the warmth of his recollection. God, how that Pole could scream. For hours he could scream. No wonder he had so little voice left now. No wonder so few sounds could come through the toothless mouth. In the beginning, Lancer had had to learn cruelty. He had been a farm boy in Silesia. He had whipped animals, a balky horse or a snarling dog, but these were acts of anger. The acceptance of the dispassionate torture of human beings had come to him with instruction. He learned the art, much as he learned to wear his shiny black uniform with the death's head insignia with comfort and ease. He had buried his qualms along with his overalls that smelled of cow dung, and had also learned to stifle his own screams when he heard his first victim screaming. Then the process had been easier. He was, by nature, a toady, a fawner. He looked up to other men. He liked having superiors. And when his dull and unimaginative brain produced a form of torture that made these superior men smile at him and congratulate him, this was fulfillment. He became addicted to praise and had a continuing need of it, which is why Zamorsky had been so important to him. And Zamorsky had been a marvelous subject, resilient, available, sometimes screaming but never protesting. To torment the Pole became a daily procedure, like brushing his teeth. All this Lancer recalled as he continued to look at the Pole, feeling as he did some link, some bond, some ligature with another time. In some incredible way, he shared something with that shuffling hulk, and because of it, he felt almost an acme of tenderness. He let his eyes move slowly over the patchwork of scar tissue on Zamorsky's face, at the milky nothingness of the right eye, and the dumb, neutral deadness of the other. Like a hunter appraising his trophies on a mantle. And then, with both compulsion and reluctance, he turned his eyes away, and in turn studied the former Gruppenführer. He liked Gruber, saw the glistening wet bald head and the blue eyes that darted left and right and kept blinking. And also, like Gruber, he sensed the fear in the other man. Lancer was disturbed seeing this fear. Mixed with his disquiet at Strobe was an admiration for the man. Strobe had been a Gruppenführer, a superior, well above him. He had been a major Nazi, one of the originals. His exploits, mentioned on 76 and separate counts at Nuremberg, were a matter of public knowledge, and to Lancer's mind made him special and very superior. But here Strobe was, standing drunk in his bar, looking fat and old and nervous. The Pole, Lancer decided to himself, could scream, because that's what Poles were for. Untermenschen, subhumans. Despite everything that had happened, there was a proper design to things. Some men were built to scream. Other men had a mission to make them scream. And a Nazi, for a Nazi to be afraid, to look as Strobe looked, well, it simply wouldn't do. He tried to smile again at Strobe, and instinctively wanted to reach out and touch his big arm again, to pet him, to reassure him, to perhaps turn him back into what he had been before. But Strobe barely looked at him. He simply stared at his reflection in the bar mirror. Gruber tells me that I look like some pale pig on its way to a slaughter. A pale pig, Lancer. Is that how I strike you? Is that the way I look? Lancer swallowed. No, Joseph, he said placatingly. You don't look like any such thing. What the hell? What the hell? You'll have nothing to fear, nothing at all. Strobe wrenched his eyes away from his reflection and stared at Lancer. First Gruber, with his gratuitous advice, and now this smirking innkeeper, this grinning horse's ass, with his own unsolicited analysis of the situation. "How is that, Lancer?" he asked. "I have nothing to fear." He grinned. "You know this for a fact, eh?" Lancer licked his lips nervously. I mean, Joseph, he said hesitantly. I mean, it doesn't appear to me that... Well... My God, thought Strobe. Of the two, the thin-lipped, long-nosed Prussian shit, and this peasant, this sycophant, this dog-robber, he could almost prefer the former. He sat down on the stool next to Lancer. "Lancer, my old friend. Whereas I look like a pale pig. Shall I tell you what you look like? Shall I tell you what you are? You are a fetcher and a pimp. You're an oversized bootlicker. You were never anything else. And you tell me I have nothing to fear. You're wrong. And if you think that you have nothing to fear, you are also wrong. Because, you see, Lancer, you have no one left to hide behind. No one, no thing. Hawk is dead. Your protector is dead. There are no more errands for you to run, so you are back where you belong. Behind a bar, with an apron, serving beer and schnitzel. And this, Lancer, he said, pounding his fist on the bar, is what is right and what is proper. This is what you were built for and born for. The murmur of voices in the room subsided. People were staring at Strobe again. His voice had carried over the smoke and the noise and pierced through a dozen conversations. Lancer was pale, but his eyes warned. "Listen to me, Joseph. Please listen to me. You are upset, that's all. You're upset. Let us have a chat, you and I, back there." He pointed to a curtained partition at the far end of the room. "Go on back, Joseph. I'll follow you. Go on back, Joseph, and I'll follow you." Strobe looked across the room and then back to Lancer and nodded. "Why not? We'll talk, you and I, Lancer, like two old friends and comrades, correct? Like two old friends and comrades." Lancer nodded and smiled tentatively. This crazy bastard could tear the place apart if he wanted to. "Of course," he said, trying to sound soothing. "We're two old friends and comrades, and we can have a chat." Strobe rose and took a step away from the bar. He looked across the room at Zamorsky, who was collecting glasses from an empty table. The Pole's stiff, jointless fingers were like those of a child, desperately engaged in some brand new and complicated game. He turned to see Strobe staring at him, and his battered mouth twisted into what looked like a smile. Then he lowered his good eye, turned away, and walked his shuffling, slow gait over to another table. His legs were scar-tissued toothpicks, barely able to sustain him. Strobe watched him for a moment, then turned back toward Lancer. "It gives you pleasure?" Lancer, tense, fearful of touching some other raw nerve, forced a smile. "He brings back memories." "Of this I have no doubt." Strobe walked the length of the bar and disappeared through the curtained partition. He entered the small, sparse room where Lancer did his bookwork. After a few minutes, Lancer came in. The two men looked at one another, Strobe challenging, Lancer timid and fearfully watchful. Strobe sat down on a threadbare sofa. Lancer leaned against the window sill and took out a cigarette, avoiding Strobe's eyes as he lighted it. "So, tell me something, Lancer," Strobe said. "I have nothing to fear." "Is that what you said?" Lancer made a nervous little movement with his shoulders. "Joseph," he said, "they took Eichmann, this we know. But why should that necessarily affect us?" Strobe leaned forward on the sofa. "Why should it affect us? That was the question, wasn't it?" He shook his head back and forth. "Where in Christ's name did you spend the war, Lancer? Or me? Oh, Gruber. Or any of the others. Were we postmen someplace in Bavaria delivering letters? Or were we street cleaners in Vienna?" His big, fleshy fingers gripped together. "They know where we are. They start with Eichmann. They don't finish with Eichmann." He felt the fear rising up in him again. "Let me tell you something, Lancer. I may well be a pale pig on the way to a slaughter, but I'm not the only pig, and there will be more than one slaughter." Lancer walked in jerky, nervous steps over to a chair and sat down. "Joseph, my friend," he said, his voice shaking, "what did you expect? Really, what did you expect, that the rest of the world was like Zamorsky?" He pointed his cigarette toward the curtain, and then shook his head. "Mindless and half-blind? Do you think our living here is a secret? Think about this, Joseph," he said, gesturing with his cigarette. "Think about it clearly. It doesn't take a secret service to come up with this information. We live here, and people know we live here. Do you remember Richter? He was at Treblinka. 100 witnesses identified his picture at Nuremberg. They had him on every count in the book. Well, let me tell you something. He kept a picture of the Fuhrer on his living room wall 2 blocks from here. He kept it hanging there until he died last year." Strobe's voice cut into the other man. "Would you keep it there tonight?" he asked. "Would you keep it there now, after what happened to Eichmann?" Lancer shook his head. He tried to keep his voice gentle and soothing. "Eichmann. You keep talking about Eichmann. Joseph, Eichmann was Eichmann. He was top echelon. He was like Bormann or Himmler or the others. He was the cream." He butted out his cigarette and rose from the chair. He was uncomfortable with Strobe. He was always uncomfortable with him. "Do you know something, Joseph?" He tried to smile. He tried to keep his voice light. "Perhaps you have delusions of significance." He forced a laugh. "Understand? Delusions?" He made a gesture with a thumb and forefinger. "We, you and I, were small potatoes, Joseph. We were minor bureaucrats." Strobe heard the words and kept staring at Lancer's mouth. How often had he heard those words? How often had he said them to himself? Always the same. The ritual of 15 years ago. What do they call it? A syndrome? That's what it was, a syndrome. The small potato syndrome. Me? You'd take me. My dear American colonel from the judge advocate's office, my illustrious Soviet commissar sitting on the tribunal, my patient and compassionate Frenchman, Briton, Pole, all of you. You'd take me? I am one of the small potatoes. Really, the small potatoes, an insignificant dot way down in the lower echelon, nothing really, a clump of earth. And they were all alike. Lancer, himself, all of them. Insignificance had been the order of the era. Self-depreciation was the only guarantee of survival. "Small potatoes, Lancer," he said. "Minor bureaucrats." His voice was soft. He shook his head. "That's not what they called us at Nuremberg. That's not what they called you or me. You were Koch's right arm. 6 witnesses said so at the trial. And I was mentioned dozens of times, Lancer." "But Koch is dead," Lancer said in a mournful little voice. "He is dead, and Nuremberg was 14 years ago." And then suddenly an anger built up in him. This bull-necked man, spreading his fear around, wrecking his own peace of mind, tearing into his composure. His voice rose and became shrill. "What are you, Joseph, anyway? Some kind of grave digger? Some kind of shroud cleaner? You burrow under tombstones like a maggot. And when you unearth some decomposed bone, you carry it screaming into public places." He felt shock at what he had said and the way he had said it, and almost immediately tried to retreat. Again, the forced smile. Again, the soothing tone. "Joseph, old friend, listen to me. This is how it's done. This is the way to get a rope around your neck. You keep carrying this Eichmann thing around town, yelling about it at the top of your lungs and sweating from it. This is how you shine a spotlight on yourself. This is how you'll get noticed." He took a few steps over toward Strobe, holding out his hands as if begging for something. "Joseph, he said. "Do me a favor. Go home now. Go home and rest. Get a night's sleep. Maybe take a vacation for a week or two. Understand? Get this thing out of your mind. Perhaps you'd best not come back here for a while. It might be safer." Strobe rose from the sofa. "Safer," he repeated. "Neither of us has anything to fear, but by my staying away from here, it'll be safer. You think like a fucking peasant. You have the logic of a man who shovels horse shit for a living. You won't admit to any fears of your own, but you'll pass a few judgments on mine, won't you? I ruin the business, is that it, Lancer? I give the place a bad name." "Joseph," Lancer said breathlessly. "Joseph, old friend, believe me." "No. Strobe interrupted him. "Believe me, Lancer. Believe me when I tell you that these are not ghosts that I run from, and they are not ghosts who'll be chasing you either. You don't understand," Lancer almost whined. Strobe's big head went back and forth. "I understand," he said hoarsely. I understand more than you know. I understand, for example, that you will keep your pole around here. You'll clutch at your little pleasures, and you'll feel relieved when I walk out of here, me and my ghosts." He took a step over toward Lancer. "But one morning, Lancer, one morning, when you wake up, you may see these ghosts hovering over your head, and then, my old friend, you may do a bit of sweating yourself, a little belated perspiration." He reached into his pocket and took out a pack of cigarettes, lighting one. He met Lancer's look, a look that carried with it both fear of himself and fascination. "What is it?" he said softly. "What disturbs you now?" "I don't know," Lancer said. "It's just that I've never seen you frightened before. I've never seen you look this way." The cigarette bobbed in Strobe's mouth. "I've never felt this way before. But it could be worse, old friend, old comrade. It could be much worse." He dragged deeply in the cigarette. "I could be Eichmann," he said softly. "I could be flying to Israel now." There was a pause. "And you could too." Lancer's smile never quite made it. His lips twisted ever so slightly. Then he closed his eyes, turned, and walked out of the room. Strobe remained there, motionless for a moment, his big shoulders bent. He took the cigarette out of his mouth and looked at its wet tip. He closed his eyes for another moment. "We made a mistake," he said aloud to the threadbare sofa. "We made a terrible mistake," he said to the chair Lancer had sat in. "We didn't kill them all," he said to the empty room. By 2:30 in the morning, whiskey had done all it could do for Strobe. It had slowed down his panic, made the wheezing bellow of a bad tuba sound like the Berlin Philharmonic, and for at least an hour had obliterated from his consciousness the name of Eichmann, the name of Gruber, his photograph in the hands of nameless men. He kept nodding and smiling and keeping time with the bald, drunken tuba player who finally passed out right on the stage and slept there for several minutes before Lancer directed that he be pulled off. At one point, Strobe had even taken a fancy to the long-legged blonde at the bar and decided that she reminded him of one Ilse Hilger, a former frequent passenger in the back seat of his Mercedes-Benz long ago. He had beckoned to her across the room and bought her a drink after she'd sat down. But by then, Strobe's whiskied fantasies were on the way out. The blonde, so enticing from the perspective of 30 feet and 2 bottles of Calvert, turned out to be an aging Cinderella, whose magic midnight had passed years before. Close up, she was a tired walker of many streets, with a backside paying the price of 1,000 bar stools and 1,000 mattresses and a social circle of men like Strobe, who borrowed her for some drunken and impassioned moments until she discovered too late that her own capacity for passion was as extinct as her virginity. For just a soft and gentle moment, Strobe had appealed to her. He had called her Liebchen and stroked her cheek, and from her own drunkenness there arose a dream. But it had lasted all too briefly. The thick-chested bald man had turned morose, knocked over her glass, and finally pushed her away. She had gone back to the bar, and finally left with a sailor who would make fumbling love to her in an alley with all the finesse of a tomcat, but at least briefly, and for pay. Strobe slept at the table, and it was hours later when he awoke and stared across the now empty room toward the bar. Lancer had disappeared. He looked at his watch. It was past 6. He looked across toward the front windows. Outside, the dawn was a sick gray pallor of a dying night and a fragile newborn morning. The place smelled of whiskey and smoke and aged urine. Strobe pushed his chair back and rose to his feet. His head felt like an overheated block of concrete, and he had to fight down nausea and dizziness as he moved toward the bar. And as he walked, it all came back. His fears were like some kind of cancer deep inside of him that woke when he did, endless and unchanging. They followed him everywhere. And as he walked, stiffly and painfully, through the gray gloom of the dirty little room, he wanted to cry. He was on a treadmill, moving from one quaking anxiety to another, and there was no hope. There was no relief. There was no end to it. But escape was an instinct with him now. Even as the despair washed over him, another portion of his mind was already dictating what the next steps were. The lessons of 15 years were most explicit. The hunted man had to live his life in little fragmentary blocks of temporary safety, clumps of seaweed to be clutched at while drowning, but nonetheless clutched at. Plans to be made, good only for the next few minutes. But this was how survival was measured, only in minutes. The lessons and the memories of them stirred inside him. It had been that way once before. The planning, the escape route, where to go and how to get there, what hours and what hiding places, back door or roof or basement or attic. At this moment, it was all he could think and all he could remember. At this moment, it had never been any other way. He looked at himself in the bar mirror and saw an imitation Strobe, an inferior model from a copying machine that had turned out an old man with haunted eyes. Then he realized that the lights had been turned out, and it was only dawn outside that illuminated the room. The place had obviously been closed for hours, and Lancer, that son of a bitch, Lancer, had not awakened him to send him home, or even to any kind of safety. He had allowed him to sleep there at the table, naked and vulnerable, just like any drunk. Zamorsky he treated better than that. Even Zamorsky. Zamorsky was probably sleeping comfortably in bed someplace. Zamorsky he had let go home. That goddamn Lancer with his insane perversions, his very special sentiments that came out of a mental asylum. Zamorsky, the Pole, and he was resting comfortably somewhere, while he, Strobe, might spend the last day of his life staring at himself in a dirty bar mirror, trying to piece together the murky imperfection of what he saw with the young and indestructible conqueror of the other time. That goddamned Lancer, that stupid and obsequious peasant shithead who allowed his guilt to walk around the bar and pick up glasses in his claws and dirty towels of the men's room and imitate a man. That goddamn Lancer, who had to take his trophies with him, even on an exodus. And then, walking around to the other side of the bar, he saw Lancer. Lancer smiled at him, a half-moon smile, but a very red moon. The smile was not formed with lips. Strobe was being grinned at from Lancer's throat, a slit in the jugular, like a second mouth. Lancer lay on his back, arms at his sides, very peaceful. No protest in the open eyes. Perplexity. Very surprised at the whole thing. On this Monday evening in Buenos Aires, in his very own bar and on his own private and personal time, Herr Lancer had had his throat cut. The unprotesting eyes looked up with more repose than Strobe had ever seen in them, and in some subconscious portion of his mind, he wondered that he himself felt no shock at this grinning and sudden death. "So, Lancer, old comrade," Strobe said in a mild conversational voice to the quiet man at his feet. "Small potatoes, or big potatoes, what difference? The pig dies the same as a lion when the throat is cut." He continued to stare down at the silent man, and to himself said, "And the same with the German. You put a blade to the windpipe, he'll bleed just like the Jew." He remained there for a long and silent moment, just staring and thinking, and from some indistinct place in his memory, something else came back to him. "Hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions? If you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge?" Strobe suddenly felt looked at. He turned very slowly. Across the room, near the curtained partition, stood Zamorsky. And almost nothing had changed. The scar tissue, who walked almost upright, the ravaged face, the one eye that had assimilated more hell and horror in an hour than most men could witness in a lifetime. It still looked out with no particular emotion. But the Pole's right hand, with the bent and misshapen fingers, the Pole's right hand was ever so slightly stained with red. Then Strobe knew. He understood. The Pole had certain attributes. He had certain strengths. On some levels he was almost human. For one thing, he had incredible patience. He could wait quietly for over 20 years. And the stiff, jointless fingers, broken so many times, would never strum a harp or caress a woman or paint a pastoral scene of the willowed banks of the Vistula. But they could carry a knife. It may have been a moment later, or an hour. Strobe knew only that he had raced out of the bar, propelled more by shock than fear, that Zamorsky could have killed. A mindless animal, or a dog, or a crocodile, it made just as much sense to find suddenly a logic and a point of view and a capacity for revenge in this hulk, this wreck, this broken thing who could not even speak. And he had killed with his logic, and God knows how many years it had been locked inside, waiting, simply waiting. It was as if in one night, one solitary night, all the order of the universe, as Strobe knew it, had been turned upside down. Jews collected Nazis, and Zamorskis killed Lancers. Strobe thought of this as he hid in the shadow of a building, looking out at the empty streets. Even then, his habit patterns were more persistent and encroaching than his shock. His manual of survival, written in sweat and sleeplessness and tension, warned him that a man was particularly vulnerable in the still, unpeopled streets of the early dawn. This was not the time for an escape, a black rabbit in the snow. So Strobe walked, in an almost tiptoed agony, his back to the stores, staying in shadows, watching as the glow of the sun touched the grayness and dispelled it. Then there were the early morning sounds of garbage cans and traffic. Shopkeepers appeared, awnings were let down, the city stirred and came to life. Strobe could then become invisible. He forced himself to walk in a measured, slow pace down the Avenida de Mayo. His legs ached. His tongue was like some sour foreign object shoved into his mouth, swelling and choking. The hot concrete inside of his head bubbled in the morning sun, and pain beat a snare drum across his chest. But he did not dare stop. He continued to walk, playing the role of the early morning stroller, past the Plaza de Mayo, crossing the Avenida Rivadavia, until he reached the soft and comforting green of the Parque del Retiro, where white-coated cleaning men stabbed fluttering pieces of paper and barely looked at him. He sat on a bench and stared across at the cathedral, where giant bells chimed out over the murmur of morning voices and morning sounds and beckoned the believers to early Mass. He watched as the lines of black-mantled women walked slowly up the stone steps toward the high oaken doors of the church. Sitting there on the bench, he felt the pain subside. His breath came back to him. His breathing, like the wheeze of a ruptured concertina, carried with it its own special pain, but this time bearable. He looked across at the church again and listened as the bells gradually diminished. God was across the street. Strobe had to smile. God was across the street, but what could he request of him? Very little, he knew. Very little. He had nailed too many Christs onto crosses 15 years before to seek or expect respite, let alone salvation, from inside a church. He let his body sag. He was so desperately tired, but he knew other things too. Even as the hot sun pierced the leaves of the trees above him, he felt the ice-cold understanding of what had happened, what had triggered Zamorsky. He could remember a decade and a half before, when the inmates of Dachau had heard the rolling thunder of the American artillery, the look they got when they stared at the SS, the hidden and secret smiles on the ravaged faces, just as Zamorsky had looked at him hours before. The night was ending. God was re-entering the world, and so the tormented had stared at them with understanding eyes and laughed their secret, silent laughter. It was this way with Zamorsky. As of the moment they had taken Eichmann, the gods began to topple. Strobe rammed his fingernails into his palm and drew blood. He knew what he should have done. He should have taken his bare hands, his still powerful hands, and wrapped them around the scrawny Polish throat to demonstrate the final lesson. No matter the hour, and no matter the year, there was still an order to things. There were those built to give pain and those to receive it. But he, Strobe, had forgotten. He had stared at the Pole, stared at him in shock and fright, stared at him in panic and disbelief. And then he had run. Supermen, he thought, smiling grimly. The myth of the master race. One god was manacled to some Jews on a plain, another lay on a dirty bar floor with his throat cut, and yet another ran down the streets of Buenes Aires on a hot May morning, listening to church bells and wondering about God. Strobe rose from the bench and again moved toward the sidewalk that circled the church. He was rational now, with the logic of all hunted animals, the ordered instinct of the prey. What next? Maybe a small hotel near the river alongside of the federal district, One of those little and nameless hotels that stood in a row. Hole in there and wait. Find the time, the hour, the place, the avenue of escape. But no, it occurred to him quickly as an afterthought, not that. If he headed in that direction, and he were being watched, they would know approximately where he was going. Back to his room. That's where he must go. He moved down the street, feeling the sun baking into him, wondering what he looked like as he smelled the sour smell of whiskey and sweat all over him. On the corner, in front of the art museum, he paused briefly, and then he saw the black sedan parked across the street, the driver and a companion alongside, not looking at him, nothing like that. Dark and indistinct faces. But Strobe's instincts froze him with a warning. He looked at the car briefly and then started up the long concrete steps toward the entrance of the art museum. The door was locked. There was a sign reading, "Open at 9." He checked his watch. 8:30. Too early. 30 minutes too early. 15 years too late. Over his shoulder, he saw the black sedan still parked there, the two men looking at him. No subterfuge now. They were looking at him. They were staring at him. Strobe walked down the steps very slowly, very carefully, as if descending a ladder from a big target. Again he sought the crowd. To stay with people, that was the prime requisite. He moved down the sidewalk to an outdoor cafe and sat down at one of the tables. A waitress, young, but with circles under her eyes, moved tiredly toward him and threw down a menu. "Coffee," he barked. "Black." "Coffee," the waitress repeated, like some kind of automaton. She disappeared into the cafe and came back a moment later with hot coffee. Strobe sipped at it, turning his head every now and then to look toward the black sedan. He saw a policeman approach the car. There was a pantomime of conversation, then the car pulled away. Strobe watched it cross the intersection and move down the next block. He checked his watch again. 5 minutes had passed. Time was on its hands and knees, crawling in slow motion. He remained at the table for the bulk of the half hour, starting every time a car drove by, jerking his head to see if it were the one. But the black sedan did not return. He did not see it again until he had left the table and was starting back on the sidewalk, when once again, just as he was passing the museum, it pulled around the corner of his side of the street. Again, he ran up the steps of the big gray building, and this time he pushed his way through the revolving doors inside. He stopped near the information desk alongside of a Bernini statue and took a handkerchief out of his hip pocket to wipe his perspiring face. His mind galloped and charged. What to do next? He put the handkerchief back into his hip pocket and stood there motionless. This was respite, but not salvation. He was safe, but for how long? The receptionist, an angular woman with hair severely pulled back into a shapeless bun, looked inquiringly at him. Strobe forced himself to smile, then turned to survey the Bernini statue. He cocked his head in the manner of a practiced and thoughtful connoisseur, pursed his lips, and whistled softly as he walked past her toward a gallery of oils off to his right. He moved into the long rectangular cavern flanked by swatches of color, sunsets and reclining nudes and landscapes and still lifes, and he stopped short. He was 4 feet away from a large canvas. A woman, obviously an American tourist, going by him, clucked disapprovingly at it and whispered some negatives to her male companion, who nodded in turn, agreeing with her. They were looking at the same canvas as Strobe, a mountain lake scene with a man fishing from a rowboat. The sky was a soft azure blue, the rock walls purple and spiraling, the lake reflecting them a deep purple. The face of the fisherman was indistinct and in a quarter profile, turned away from the brush as he might turn from a camera lens. "Like a rather bad postcard," Strobe heard the woman say to her companion. "Will you look at the colors? I mean, really? Have you ever seen anything quite like it? Outside of a drugstore rack, that is." "Sign painters," the man responded with a regal lift of the eyebrow. "Poster dabblers," he added, his voice like that of a jurist dismissing a petty case of thievery. "Why is it that the bad painter will always and invariably attempt to improve on God and nature?" Their voices drifted off down the long room while Strobe stood there, looking at the boat and the mountain lake and the outline of the fisherman. The fisherman with the broad shoulders, the heavily muscled back, the bald head visible underneath a slouched cap. The fisherman, contented and tranquil, unassaulted by any force or entity or opponent. He sat there, relaxed, with his back against one of the gunwales, his fishing rod limp over the side, the purple water lapping gently against the hull. There was a warm sun touching him, soothing him. There was a breeze, yes, a breeze that rippled the water, and it was all captured on canvas, all of it captured, all of it painted into changelessness. And the fisherman, it was unmistakable. The fisherman was him, Strobe. He was in the rowboat. He was on the mountain lake. He felt a tremor run through him, shock, surprise, a wonder that galvanized and stunned. It was as if he had suddenly walked into a revelation. But even as he stood there in the aftermath of this revelation, Strobe felt something else akin to neither shock nor surprise. It was as if he were a man ending his search and finding, without ever having doubted that he would find, feeling a quiet gladness, and knowing with certainty that a man could hunger only so long. Then there had to be, some kind of forgiving God. But part of the revelation was in the change in Strobe's hunger. He had goose-stepped half of his life along with a generation of other men, marching toward what they all believed was immortality. But their flags had withered away, their leather boots had rotted, along with 1,000,000 men who had worn them. This was part of Strobe's certainty as he stood staring raptly at the painting. He had been hungering for the wrong things. He had spent the second half of his life trying to regain pages of a calendar. But now he knew. Time was irretrievable. Time died just as men did, and he could no longer goose-step as in the past any more than he could furtively slink as he had been doing in the present. If there was indeed an escape for him, there it was, in a painting, existing an arm's length away, beckoning, inviting, calling out to him in a language of serenity and peace, a condition he had never known, but now craved like an addict. "I am in the picture. I am, I believe. I am because I believe. I am in a rowboat. I feel the sun. I feel the wind. I am on the lake. If I reach down, I'll feel the wetness of it. If I put my head up, I'll smell the moss and the pines, the damp earth and the wind." And then it happened. The floor bobbed underneath him, a to and fro motion, like a little boat gently prodded by an errant wind. He opened his eyes. The sun warmed him. The purple mountains loomed over him, protecting. He saw his fishing rod and oarlock. He felt the gunwale against his back, and he smelled the scent of lichen and moss and distant green earth. And he felt peace. Some mystic surgery had removed his cancer and left him clean, unassailed. His body and mind, burned out and scourged by endless running, endless jeopardy, and endless pain, were soothed, eased, lulled, given respite, given salvation. I want nothing more. I ask for nothing more, only to be frozen into this timeless canvas. You there, God, you invisible thing reputed to be forgiving and compassionate, I ask little. Just leave me this painted sun. Leave me this painted lake. Leave me this cannon, this promised place, this Eden made of oil and varnish. I cannot leave it. I cannot. But the lake disappeared. The rolling boat turned into a concrete floor. The mountains dissolved into a gallery of paintings. The gentle, wafting breeze was a woman's voice, nasal and harsh. Look at this one. Will you look at this one? Strobe was back in the museum. He wanted to scream at the woman to shut her mouth, to stop destroying his idol. Please, please, give him back his respite, his peace. But the forgiving God had turned his back on Strobe, much as he had turned his back on Strobe's victims of long ago. Reality had returned. And there was the pain again, the fear. The tension was like an anchor hooked into his flesh, dragging him down. He turned toward the woman's voice, and to the painting across from him, the object of her attention. Unforgettable, the woman snorted. Where in the name of God is taste gone? Her voice was a portrait of disapproval as seen through a lorgnette, superior and final. Strobe looked at the other painting. It showed a man hanging from a wooden cross in a concentration camp prison yard. A swastika was flying on one of the background buildings. The prisoner's face was caught in a shaft of pale sunlight. His agony etched deep into dark lines. The eyes reflected the endless Gethsemane. Strobe looked at it with no feeling. He was unmoved. It was as if he were a surgeon examining blood. Blood carried with it no horror. It was part of his profession. It was an abstract byproduct of his labors. To kill Jews, to string them up, to render them pain. These were natural acts, neutral, and could imply no judgment, like swatting flies, or grinding a heel on a bug, or tacking a butterfly to a board. And flies and bugs and butterflies could never be perceived by Strobe to be victims. So looking briefly at the picture, he felt only a passing boredom. The surging rage that rose up in him had no connection with the painting of a 20th century minor Christ. It was directed at the American tourist whose voice had intruded upon his dream and had kidnapped him back into reality. He glared at her as she and the man continued down the corridor, dismissing the paintings one after the other, and dismissing Strobe with a single perfunctory glance as they walked away. Strobe, left alone, turned his eyes back toward his painting. He moved closer to it and reached out and touched it, closing his eyes, concentrating. But this time nothing happened. The canvas was hard to the touch. The rippling waters were nothing but purple paint. The azure sky was a rough, uneven pigment. The fisherman was just an outlined form made of oil, but not flesh. There was no heartbeat. There was no life. He heard a warning cough from a guard who had just entered the room and dropped his hand quickly, shoving it into his pocket. He turned away, averting the guard's stern look, and forced himself into an unhurried pace, letting his eyes wander past the portraits, looking at them with feigned interest, but not really seeing them. Already, he had turned back into a tired automaton. He was like a computer thrown together with bones and nerve endings, programmed and calibrated to perform only one function: to seek out danger, to recognize jeopardy, to stay alive. He knew only the facts related to survival. There was a car outside with 2 men in it. They had his photograph and his name on a list. There was a Pole named Zamorsky. There was someone named Eichmann flying at 30,000 feet, heading for a gallows where he would die just inches off the ground. The facts, and with them the names and faces, were a clangorous bell that clapped back and forth inside of his mind. Nothing had changed. It was all as it was before. He spent a fitful, nervous hour wandering through the various galleries, past a Hals, a Vermeer, and a Picasso. He pondered with a great show of interest next to a Klee, and forced himself to look somehow charmed by a collection of impressionists. He wandered past statuary, and some mobiles, and some meaningless abstract drivel of someone like Jackson Pollock, but none of it made any sense to him. For no matter where he walked, and no matter where he aimed his eyes, he was conscious of only one thing. He had been the victim of a monstrous practical joke. He had been led by some gentle, helpful hands through a portal into heaven, only to be pulled back down into hell. Just before leaving the museum, he cast one last look into the gallery where it had begun. The view of the mountain lake was obstructed by a hanging mobile. Only one man was in the room. This was an elderly Jew, staring at the concentration camp picture and softly crying. "Alte Jude, old Jew." Strobe thought the words. "Don't stand there wetting yourself with tears and searching for God. God is the wishful thought conjured up by dying men, naked and defenseless and in desperation, calling to a benefactor who does not exist. He is a product of pain and only that." This is what Strobe thought as he walked through the lobby of the building and out into the street. He paused briefly, looking to left and right. The car was gone. In its place was a sign announcing that there was 15 minutes parking only. Standing there in the hot sun, Strobe had an almost irresistible urge to laugh. "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, and the avenging angels," so long as the wrath takes no longer than 15 minutes, or at least can be handled without double parking. Strobe felt giddy, light-headed, and he knew fairly close to some kind of crack-up. He had taken all he could take for a protracted period of hours. There was a point reached where mind and body had to rebel. He took to the sidewalks, recrossed the Plaza de Mayo, walked past the cathedral, and once again into the Parc del Retiro, and finally stopped at a public phone booth at the far end of the narrow avenue of the Cala Florida. There were friends he could call, for money, or for hiding places, or for advice. The first number was busy. That was Bach's. He was a respected stockbroker now who had once been with the SS, but Bach was busy buying and selling his municipal bonds. Then he phoned Dietzel. Dietzel owned a grocery store on the other side of the city. He had many children and many bedrooms. But Dietzel was not in, so said his wife. And who was calling? A friend, Strobe told her, and then he hung up. Names and faces made brief appearances on the stage of his brain, and were perfunctorily dismissed. Lancer, the obvious one. This one would be loaning no more money to anyone. And Gruber, that Prussian son of a bitch, with his connections, his manipulations, he was the most obvious and by far the most able to help, but the least accessible, especially after the scene of the previous night. No, he could not seek help from Gruber. He was certain of that. But of other things, of his plans, of whatever might be the modus operandi of his survival, these he was not sure of at all. He left the phone booth and started once again to walk past the row of shops with the crowds of people filling up the avenue. Somehow, and sometime, he would have to get help from the outside. He knew this. This part of the plan carried with it the only simplicity that he knew. But for the moment he would go back to his room. That covered the next 60 minutes, and this was how he must parcel out his life from then on, in little slabs of minutes. As he walked, he let his mind wander again. Already, that brief feeling of peace, so elusive, so ephemeral, was nothing but a vague memory. It was this hot sun that had reality. It was the long, expansive street where any moment the black car might appear. This is what had substance. He paused for a moment underneath the awning of the florist shop. His mind was full of gears and wheels turning and meshing. Hiding place, route to a hiding place, escape. But where would he go? Where could he go? It was like 1945 all over again. It was like the Czech border and the Prague factory and all the other way stations of so long ago. The heat was almost unbearable. The sun, a shaft of furnace air that followed him even in the shade. But he forced his mind to function and knew then that his room was so obvious as to be not obvious. That's where he'd go for the time being. His room. That stifling, airless little cubicle that for the next 60 minutes at least would be his fortress. He wondered then, looking beyond the dark shade of the awning into the white sunlight, whether or not the black car was still out there somewhere. There were many cars and many people. The pursuers sought invisibility in crowds, just like the pursued. And perhaps the driver and the other occupant were on the sidewalk already, following him. Perhaps across the street, under another awning. Perhaps inside of one of the stores, peering at him through the glass, watching him, studying him, surveying him in his movements. Or at the outdoor cafe. Maybe they were drinking coffee and just waiting. But he had no choice at this moment. Stay with the crowds. Stay with them until he could find his hiding place. He joined a group of shoppers and walked with them for 3 blocks until a jitney pulled up to its stop on the corner. He waited until the last moment, then hurriedly jumped on. He rode the jitney to the midsection of the city, a quarter of a mile from his hotel, and then he got off and walked again. His eyes twisting and revolving, his mind like a thin string of wire, pulsating as it sought out danger. Then he was in his room. He closed the door and locked it, then bolted the night latch. Fatigue was a dead weight attached to him, a part of him. He lay down on his bed. The room was, as usual, hot, dark, and close, smelling of him and strong laundry soap, and some neutral mustiness defying origin that enveloped the tiny space. But it was familiar. The heat and the smells, they belonged to him. And then he was on his back on wet sheets, staring up at the cracked ceiling. It was as if the bulk of his life was his uncomfortable horizontal perusal of ceilings and walls, a lifetime of itchy, sodden moments flowing slowly into other itchy, sodden moments. He must sleep now, he decided. There would be more running. The escape had not really even begun, but for the time being there must be sleep. He closed his eyes and lapsed into what passed for rest, sporadic, fitful dozing, full of spasmodic dreams, each in turn featuring a brief walk-on of a person from his past. Lancer was there for a moment, with his smiling red throat, and the milky-eyed Zamorsky, of course, staring at him as if American artillery could be heard just over the hill coming to his defense. And inexplicably, there was the face of the Hungarian gypsy he had once interrogated at number 8 Prinz Albrechtstrasse when they had brought him in. For some reason, his sleeping mind remembered this incident clearly. It had been a long interrogation, ending with needles thrust into the gypsy's eyes, and he could remember the gypsy staring up at him through the red fog, through the maimed and useless orbs, as if he still retained some kind of sight. And the gypsy had cursed him. He could even remember the words. "My pain is brief," the gypsy had said, "but yours, Gruppenführer, yours will last for an eternity. I will that to you. I leave it to you as a legacy. Pain. Eternal pain." There were the gypsy's face and the sound of his voice parading across Strobe's unconscious mind. Other names, other faces. A dog he had once owned that he had named Blondie, just as the Führer had named his Alsatian bitch. And the dog's bark. It came back to him. And the officers' club at the SS barracks near Dusseldorf, where he had sung so many songs and pounded his tankard on the table, pounded it and pounded it. In his dreams, he stopped the pounding, but it continued, more pounding, loud and persistent, and he awoke. There was someone at the door. It was the landlady's voice, petulant and irritated. "Mr. Strobe." He bolted upright in bed. "Mr. Strobe." The landlady's voice whined at him through the door. "You're wanted on the telephone." Strobe grunted a muffled thank you and got out of bed. He waited until he heard the landlady's footsteps disappearing down the hall. Then he carefully unlocked the door and unlatched the bolt. He took a step out into the corridor, looking to left and right, then walked toward the phone on the wall near the landing, with the receiver hanging down limply like a broken arm. And then it suddenly hit him. Who knew he was there? Who had followed him? His palms were wet as he picked up the receiver and put it to his ear. No sound. No distant breathing from the other end. He cleared his phlegmy, constricted throat and heard himself say, "Hello." There was no answer at the other end. Just silence. "Hello," he said again, louder. "Who's there?" Still no answer. Strobe felt the sweat on his face. "This is Schultz," he said idiotically. "Is Herr Schultz speaking? Whom did you wish to speak to?" And as he said it, he knew it was idiotic. It was dull and lame and pointless. The time for subterfuge was long past. Whoever had called on the phone knew who he was and where he was. But there was still no answer, and then there was a click at the other end. "Hello," Strobe said. "Hello." He pushed the phone cradle up and down. "Hello," he kept saying persistently, but the line was dead. Strobe slowly replaced the receiver. He looked down the flight of steps, wondering if he should ask the landlady if the person had left a name. No, he decided, best not. He turned and walked down the hall and back into his room. He locked the door again and rebolted the night latch, and stood there trying to breathe the hot, still air. Small lapping waves of pain swept across his chest, and he knew why. His fears now once again had a form. Almost everything else could have been explained away, even the men in the car. They could even have been brush salesmen from Brazil, or a couple of American tourists waiting for their wives. But this, a phone call to him, that was explicit and pinpointed his jeopardy, like his photograph in the hotel room. Someone knew where he was. Someone had been following him. He was under surveillance, and of course, it had to be Israeli. It had to be. Once again, he went over to the bed and sat down, slowly massaging his chest. Odd, the thought came to him. Very odd. To be pursued by Jews, and to be so frightened that his heart was trying to pound its way out of his body. Once again, the monologue. Strobe, old chap, what can they do to you? Think of the worst now. Think of the absolute worst. They could apprehend you. They could spirit you away in a car, and then to the aerodrome, and then to Israel, and then what? Think of the worst now, Strobe. The worst. A trial, of course. Certainly, there must be a trial. A bookish biblical breed like the Jews would insist on a ritual of law and order, a set of statutes, legal precedents, unofficial charges, and prescribed punishments. But Strobe, old chap, what of the punishments? What would they do to you? Again, the worst. Kill you? Hang you? And what of that? 30 seconds, 40 at the most, of strangulation, of screaming silently for air, less than a minute of agony. Strobe, you remember, of course, don't you? You've seen men die. You've seen them die for 2, 3, 6 hours. You've seen strangulations performed by experts that would take an afternoon. So think rationally now. What is the worst? This time, burying his face into the pillow, he forced his eyes closed. There was a moment, just a single moment, when he remembered the picture in the art museum, the fisherman in the rowboat on the mountain lake. A brief insanity, he thought, a delusion generated by his fear, the absolute bottom level in the pit of his desperation. But the scene, a lake, the boat, the peace. Old Jews and Gruppenführers, take note. Ask nothing of God and expect nothing in return. The best that can be hoped for is insanity. The ultimate in man's condition is madness. This must be his salvation. The pain subsided in his chest, and his eyes remained closed of their own volition. But his fear stayed with him, perched on the end of the bed, resting with him on the pillow, blooming deep inside of his head like a poison plant. But now he had to sleep. Both body and mind had taken all they could for that one moment. He had to sleep. A few minutes later, he floated in the black design of things, mercifully unaware of Poles, Hungarian gypsies, barking dogs, and the unbearable pain of living. Some sleepless sentry post inside of his mind, near the border of his wakefulness, gave him warning. The quiet sound outside of his room. But he heard it immediately, and was awake in an instant, muscles and nerves taut, heart pounding. He rose quietly from the bed and walked across the room toward the door. He heard the sound again, the scrape of a foot across a thin carpet, then the squeak of a shoe, and the scrape again, this time louder, closer to the door. Strobe flattened himself against the wall, conscious suddenly of the smallness of the room, its one window, 3 flights up with neither ledge nor fire escape. He had already checked that. A shabby and mean little trap with an antiquated night latch standing between him and whatever nightmare was in the corridor. The shuffling sound came to an end with one more scrape across the carpet, then a muffled sound against the door. Not a fist, more like the palm of a hand. Strobe stopped breathing. He heard the sound again. "Who is it?" he whispered. "Who's out there?" There was a silence from the other side of the door, then a voice in return. "Herr Strobe? Open the door, Herr Strobe." The voice was a low whistle, like a broken flute. Strobe needed no clues as to identity, but they were there for him. The shuffling drag of a crippled foot, the voice sepulchral and rusty from disuse, the muffled scratch on the door that could only from a hand broken and re-broken. Strobe undid the night latch and slowly opened the door. Zamorsky stood there in the corridor. Still he looked no different. His one eye gazed blandly at Strobe, neither angry nor accusing, if anything, suggestive of an apology. The corners of his thin, bloodless mouth arched upwards, like a smile, almost a smile, but not quite a smile. "Herr Strobe," he said in his thin, reedy voice, "I followed you, Herr Strobe." Strobe backed into his room, and the cadaver followed him in. "I followed you," he repeated. "I found out where you went." Strobe stared at him, fascinated. The perverse, unwilling, and yet compulsive interest of the man who buys a ticket to a freak show. "What do you want, Zamorsky?" he asked. "What are you doing here?" "I followed you." "So you said. You followed me. You followed me, and you found me. So here we are, Zamorsky. So you have business to transact with me? You have something to tell me or something to do to me? Get it over with." "Herr Lancer is dead." "Of this I am aware. I saw Herr Lancer. I saw his throat." "You saw his blood on my hand. I killed him, you know. I cut his throat." It was remarkable, thought Strobe, quite remarkable. The ghost was so conversational and so rational, so matter-of-fact, so dispassionate about things. He had slit Lancer's jugular, and here they discussed it back and forth like a couple of old cronies talking of some mutual friend with a sore throat. "What is that to me?" Strobe asked. "I wasn't planning to make an issue of it. You've done away with him in your own way. That was your business. That was not my business." The apparition stared at him. "Wouldn't you? Wouldn't you like to know why?" Incredible, Strobe thought. Absolutely incredible. Now there came the logic of the thing, the explanation. A ghost with his dialectics. Zamorsky didn't wait for a reply. He moved closer to the bed. "He did all this to me," he said, turning his broken fingers toward himself. "My bones, my body, my face, my eyes. He did all this to me. He did it with whips and with chains and with branding irons. He did it with racks and pincers and nails and thumbscrews. He did it with screwdrivers and lighted cigarettes. Incredible, thought Strobe. The Pole has made an inventory of his torment. He has remembered everything, total recall, and Lancer had called him mindless. So what do you want me to do about it, Zamorsky? I never touched you. I did nothing to you. And Herr Lancer has been paid back for whatever he's done. You saw to that? But have you, Herr Strobe? The one eye suddenly lighted up. Have you paid? He laughed aloud, a cacophony of sound that was startling in its suddenness and loudness. Gruppenführer Strobe, the Pole said, raising a withered right arm. Do you know how long I've waited for this? Do you know? I have waited 12 lifetimes, and would you like to know something else? A really incredible thing. But there have been moments when I felt sorry for Herr Lancer. I felt sorry for him because he had no idea what he was doing. He was insane like the rest of you, and I felt sorry for him. That is astonishing, nicht wahr? That the corpse can feel sorry for the gravedigger? That even after all of this, there is still something human left inside me that makes me feel for another man. Strobe's mouth felt dry. He felt like a prisoner in the dock. The courtroom was this dark, airless little cell, and the prosecutor was this wraith, this specter, this chimera, who lived when he should have died, who killed when he himself was the victim of murder, who stalked and accused when all the logic and reason on earth dictated that it should be the other way around. Strobe stared at the apparition and then struck out at him, conscious, even as he did so, that he felt no anger, even when the flat of his hand touched the face, and he felt no satisfaction at all when the pole doubled up like a bent willow and landed on the floor. Zamorsky lay there for a moment, then slowly rose to his hands and knees and stared up at Strobe. There was no anger in return in the look. To receive pain by blow, whip, branding iron, anything? This was his way of life. Zamorsky, Strobe said softly. I can't let you live. You know this, don't you? Zamorsky nodded. Of course, he said, matter-of-factly. But I must tell you something, Herr Strobe. I pass this on to you now as a lesson, something you have never learned. You cannot create life by killing. I know that now myself, because tonight I killed, and I created nothing. The pole, scrabbling, pushing, hanging on to things, got back to his feet and stood there. So I have paid, Herr Strobe. The small and tenuous voice seemed to come from a tunnel 100 miles away. I, Zamorsky the Pole, have paid by learning the lesson. But I put the question to you. Have you paid? Have you paid for all your sins against God? Have you paid for your whips and your gas ovens and your murder camps? I, Zamorsky, the Pole, with no bones left, and no flesh left, and no hope left, I put the question to you, Herr Strobe. Have you paid? It seemed the most natural thing in the world for Strobe to do precisely what he did do, reach out and take the thin, pipe-like neck into his hands. He pulled the pole close to him and very slowly began to squeeze, gradually increasing the pressure with all the strength he had. And while he did so, he had a thought. In all the 15 years of hell, in all the sleepless nightmares, in all the ravaging fear, this was a fresh incubus. This was the flesh and blood victim come back to haunt. This grotesque somnambulist who persisted in walking and breathing and talking when long ago he should have relinquished himself to worms, followed him and took away his sleep and would try to reveal his whereabouts. As his fingers tightened around Zamorsky's throat, it occurred to him that there would be an irony to this particular death. Zamorsky, the Pole, would have to suffer himself to die, only because of his persistence about naming his murderers. The one eye looked straight into Strobe's face as his breath was slowly shut off. No anger, even now. The same resignation. The dispassionate acceptance of death was identical to his lifelong acceptance of agony. But before his breathing stopped and the one eye closed, he dredged down into the furnace of his life and conjured up one last spark. Strobe, he said, as death overtook him. Strobe, still you lose. You always lose. Then the breathing stopped. The frail thing that had been Zamorsky the Pole collapsed under Strobe's grip. A docile and weightless corpse, a bag of parchment skin and toothpick bones slumped to the floor, leaving behind only an aged agony and the echo of a voice. Strobe lighted a cigarette and sat on the bed, staring down at the corpse. Not remorse, he decided. That was not what he felt. Just some vague stirring of regret that it had happened so quietly and so inconsequentially. The Zamorskys of this earth were slowly, piecemeal, destroying him, and when he strangled one of them in his bare hands, it should have been more poetic and more emotional, and an incident of some note. As it was almost as if it had never happened. Only the thin, crumpled figure on the floor reminded him of the act, and even this, Strobe felt, was quite unfair. He would still suffer his nightmares. Somehow, Strobe thought, disjointedly, there must be a clue to all of this. It lay somewhere in the fact that the Pole could die with such calmness and self-possession, while he himself would go back to fighting death, joyless and sick with fear, desperate to prolong something that had no value and had run out of meaning. I clutch at life, Strobe thought. I clutch at it because it is all I know and all I have. I have nothing else. I am a 47-year-old expatriate from a dead country, a lost era, a departed time. I have some shirts and some pants and a bed to sleep in when I can sleep. But I have nothing else. I have not a goddamned thing else. He looked down at the dead Pole. Incredible, he thought. Simply incredible. That lump on the floor, that unknown and unmourned collection of scarred skin. He is richer than I. He is happier than I. God alone knows, some God, whatever, that death is the cheapest thing. It is life that costs. Strobe closed his eyes and sat motionlessly on the bed. This was his insanity. Not that he imagined himself to be transformed into portraits on gallery walls, but that, after life had beaten him and torn him to pieces and burned him out and left him rootless and without a single dream, that he should still hunger for life. He opened his eyes and stared up at the ceiling. There it was, slowly taking form, flowing gradually into the proper lines and the proper colors. A rowboat, a mountain lake, the smell of moss and damp earth and distant flowers. He rose from the bed. I don't care, he said to the dead pole, if I am simply going mad and that none of it exists. I tell you, I don't care. It is all I have left. It is simply all I have left. He walked out of the room, down the corridor and the stairs and outside into the street. Layers of pink and gold stretched across the sky as the day surrendered to twilight. That a whole day had passed with something that Strobe was only dimly aware of. The two violent deaths with the magic interval of the art museum had robbed him of the perspective of time. He studied the sidewalk in both directions, noting that already shops were closing. Traffic had slowed down. The city had entered the quiet interval between day's end and the noisy, neon play period that marked the night. Strobe walked down the sidewalk to the corner and waited for a bus. He had no plan left. Instinct, some kind of reflective sixth sense, told him to stay on the move. But it was a move with no particular direction and no particular destination. He took a half-empty bus back toward the center of the city. He got off on the corner of one of the countless little side streets full of nondescript bars, blaring out nondescript guitar music and flamenco and a repetitious beat of a tango. He went into the first bar he saw and sat down on a stool. He ordered a double bourbon from a dour, silent bartender, and when it came, cupped the glass in his hand as if it were hot coffee. He sipped at it, long, luxurious slurps, while the bartender stared at him, unsmiling. He felt the liquid hot in his throat and then hot in his innards. He had had no food for over 20 hours, and after the first drink, he could feel the enveloping glow of alcohol begin to push away the tensions. He ordered another double, and this one he threw down in a gulp, and then savored the gradual dulling of sight and sounds. Already he was beginning not to give a damn that Zamorsky was dead in his room, and that at this moment he was nothing but a cork bobbing in the sea of the city, with literally no place to go. He smiled at the bartender and tapped his finger on the bar for another round. It was poured and handed to him, and the room, to Strobe, was beginning to look cozy and comfortable. Stronger, more lasting, and persistent than any whiskey was a little nugget of knowledge inside of his brain that told him this was ersatz. This diminishing of tension was the counterfeit contentment of the middle stage of a drunk. But his mind was too worn and frazzled from the collective shocks of the day to really care much. He smiled again at the bartender, feeling a rising compulsion to talk, to be friendly, to make comment on things. "You have a nice place here," he said thickly, with his accent. "A very nice place. I like small and intimate bars. The bartender nodded, not giving a good goddamn what kind of bar this German preferred. "You should have music, though," Strobe said with mild reprobation. The bartender nodded again, winding up his classification of the heavy-set man in front of him. He knew the type. It was a familiar breed of compulsive drinker who would spend at least 2 hours trying to escape into a bottle and getting very profound in the process. If you ignored them, they sometimes showed up. He turned his back and busied himself drying some glasses, but Strobe's voice followed him. "A friend of mine had a bar near the Palacio del Congreso. He had a tuba player who played every evening. He himself played the bass. The customers would join in the singing." The bartender, his back to Strobe, nodded a terse, short nod. "His name was Lancer. Not much of a man, really. A countryman of mine. That much he was. But a wheedler, a fawner with certain delusions. That was his trouble. He had delusions." The bartender looked up at Strobe's reflection in the bar mirror. This one would go on for quite some time. He was sure of this. Why the hell did the mouths always come in here? Strobe smiled at him. "I, myself," he continued portentously, "have no delusions. None. I know what the world is." The liquor bubbled inside of him, loosening his restraint. "The world is actually a cesspool. It is a septic tank. Were you aware of that? And we humans are very small turds floating along in it, with the singular destiny of being dissolved. That, my friend, is what the world is and what we are." The bartender nodded again in agreement with this talkative plumbing expert. The world was indeed a septic tank and a cesspool, if that's what the man wanted, or it was an Elysian fields. The customer was always right. Particularly, he decided, when the customer had already had 8 shots of bourbon and had red-rimmed, brooding eyes and a look on his face that could mean trouble. Strobe turned in his stool to survey the room. The faces of the people kept slipping in and out of focus, detaching themselves into twins. Strobe had to squint to make each face become one again. He catalogued the faces, searching for eyes that might be interested and sympathetic, find someone, perhaps, who would understand. He wanted to talk about the picture in the art museum and what had happened that afternoon, and how desperately, and with a sick ache, he craved to relive the experience. If he could just find someone to talk to discuss things with. The Jews, for example, they could talk about what had been done to them and why it was so necessary that it had been done. But then, even better, some new thing emerged, shining in Strobe's mind. A woman. That's what he would like now. A woman. Some fat and buxom body that he could burrow against, some thickly built, fleshy form with giant breasts and meaty thighs, a tub of a woman that he could put his fingers against to touch and feel and pinch and squeeze and hurt. Hurt. This is what he wanted. It was a part of his passion, and always had been, though he had never allowed himself to think of it that way. Pain and passion had always been intertwined in all of the endless hours on back seats and barrack mattresses and everywhere else he had taken a woman. His language of love had been a woman's scream. He could not kiss without biting. He could not caress without tearing. He could find no fulfillment unless it came with the giving of pain. But he could explain this, too, if he could find someone to talk to. He left the bar stool and moved his heavy bulk across the room, stumbling against a chair, knocking a glass off a table. One couple looked up, startled, whispered something, and then turned away. The bartender kept staring at him, his long, sallow face grim. That goddamn drunken hiney would start something sure as hell. One hand slid under the bar to a blackjack hidden behind some bottles. Strobe paused in the center of the room and blinked his eyes, staring, listening, hungering for things, hungering to be a part of the conversations, hungering to be one of them, hungering to live. Yes, that was it. To live. He had to live, as Zamorsky had had to live. Suffering all the torments of hell on earth, he had yet had to live, if only for his revenge. And he, Strobe, had to live as well, because life was all there was. It was precious and irreplaceable, and its value was infinite. He must live. His drunken, haggard eyes swept across the room as people stopped their conversation to look at him. "I must tell you all something," he said thickly. "I must tell you all that life is the thing. Living is the thing. Existing, being, that is all that counts." The tears rolled down his face. I, Strobe, must live. I must be. Then blindly, he stumbled across the room and out the door, leaving behind a collective murmur of surprise, of questions that followed him into the night. To clutch at seaweed as it floated by, or at thin, fragile straws, or at a frail, errant hope. This was the night for clutching. So Strobe went to Herr Gruber's apartment. To hell with pride, to hell with worrying about a feast of humble pie, to hell with everything except survival. He remembered, from a long time before, someone pointing out Gruber's apartment to him. Very fancy, very posh. Herr Gruber was an expatriate of some means. A doorman out front, a carpeted lobby. Strobe went there, ready to rip open the front doors with his bare hands, ready to strangle the doorman or kill the elevator operator or climb up the side of the building, whatever was needed to see Gruber, whatever was required to tell him that he must have a passport, he must have money, he must use Gruber's connections to clutch. That was the order of the night, to clutch at all things, at everything, so that he would live and see the morning and the other mornings. As he expected, there was an argument with the doorman. No, the Grubers were not seeing anyone. No, he would not phone up to the Gruber apartment. No, it was a waste of his time. But Strobe had simply pushed him out of the way and gotten into the self-service elevator and taken the ride up. He did not hear the doorman shouting after him, screaming at him that the Grubers were only seeing relatives and personal friends, that something had happened. Strobe heard none of it. He got off on the third floor where he had heard Gruber's apartment was. He walked down the carpeted corridor, arrived at the properly numbered door and pounded on it. After a moment, the door opened. A woman, dressed in black, Gruber's Brazilian wife. He had heard of her, too. White blonde hair, an aristocratic face, stern, forbidding, but beautiful nonetheless. Strobe felt his impetus slipping, but desperation drove him on. "Frau Gruber," he said with a bow. "Frau Gruber, I am a friend of your husband's. It is imperative that I see him." He stepped inside, putting a foot against the door. Please allow me to talk to him. It will only take a moment." The woman stared at him noncommittally. "And you are?" "Strobe." He supplied her with the information. "Joseph Strobe. I was with the German army." He tacked this on. False credentials like a door pass, manufactured just for the moment. "The German army," he repeated. "Your husband knows me very well." He watched the woman as she looked him up and down. An odd one, he thought. She was not afraid. He knew what he must look like, sweating and smelling and wild, but yet she was not afraid. "Herr Strobe," she asked softly, "when did you last see my husband?" "Yesterday evening," Strobe said hurriedly. "We had a chat together at Lancer's Rathskeller. We had a long chat." He wet his lips, his eyes furtively looking around and beyond her, hoping Gruber was there and would come out. "As a matter of fact," he tried to sound boyish and pleasant and to laugh, "we had a few words together. That is the point of the call. I felt I should apologize. We are both under a strain." His eyes searched her face. Did she know? Was she aware of what was happening to him and to Gruber? Did she know of the black sedans and the photographs and the rest of it? He wanted to ask her directly, but her coolness, her self-assurance, the way she looked at him, it kept him off balance. It made him afraid to ask. "Is he in?" Strobe asked. "May I see him?" Again, he noticed that the woman was studying him, a careful, probing look. What in Christ's name did she want of him? Why couldn't she answer his simple questions? Was Gruber in or was he out? Was he receiving or was he packing his bag inside of his bedroom? Why, in Christ's name, couldn't she just tell him? "Is he in, Frau Gruber?" His voice took on a grating, jagged edge as more of his desperation forced itself into his tone. "It's really quite imperative that I see him." "Herr Strobe," the woman said to him, "when he came home yesterday evening, he told me of his conversation with you. He told me much of you." Strobe felt sudden surprise. "He spoke of me?" he asked. "Of me? Strobe?" "Joseph Strobe. And you had something to do with Auschwitz. You were a good Nazi, my husband said, an exceptionally good Nazi." Strobe tried to read something into the woman's words, into her inflection. A good Nazi. But was she saying that as a judgment, or as a passing commentary, or as an accusation? The woman was inexplicable. She was opaque glass, impossible to see through, impossible to analyze. Strobe felt nerves on top of nerves, new fear enveloping his constant and familiar fear. I served with the SS, he said. So my husband said, "Tell me, Herr Strobe, were you as successful at your job as my husband mentioned? He led me to believe that you were quite an important man." Ah, thought Strobe, one of us, no question about it, one of us, a clear-headed woman, a wise woman. He felt the aged pride come back to him like a mantle draped over his shoulders. He smiled. He made his voice sound important. "I was a Gruppenführer, Frau Gruber." "So," she said to him softly, "and you killed many people." It seemed to Strobe that she was smiling at him. Fine, excellent. She wanted to hear, so he would tell her. "Many?" he asked her. "Many people?" And then it came out of him, a pouring, unchecked torrent of pride flooding over the ramparts of years of restraint and fear. "You might say, Frau Gruber, that I had a hand in the destruction of a sizable number of enemies of the state. Consider, if you will, please, that there were many men under me, but by my orders, by my direct orders, I would imagine that several thousand were put into the ovens. At least that many." He felt his hands shake as he spoke, and looked down at them. He tried to stop the shaking, but it was impossible. This, however, was no movement of fear. This was the pride again, the excitement that came with the pride, because he could remember other hands, clawing, grasping hands, pleading, begging hands, torn and broken hands. The memory filled him with warmth, and again pride. Pride. They had shaken the earth, he and the others. That part of history was no myth. They had collected one half of the world and put barbed wire around it. "I am pleased, Frau Gruber," he said thickly, feeling the liquor again. "I am most pleased that you understand. There are many who don't." "Jews?" she supplied. He looked at her suddenly. "Why, yes," he agreed. "Jews. They're after my husband, these Jews." So she did know. Well and good. Better that way. "Yes," he said, sympathetically. "They're after your husband, and after me, but I can assure you, Frau Gruber, I can assure you that your husband and I are made of the same stuff. We don't roll over and die just because a handful of Jews decide to throw a net over us. Not your husband and I. We are not that kind of man." It was then that he saw the look on her face, a subtle change, an almost imperceptible alteration. The change in itself revealed nothing, but still, there was a change. "Herr Strobe," she said after a moment's pause, "I don't know really what kind of man you are, but I know my husband, or at least I knew him. He would never permit himself to be taken by the Jews. That kind of irony he couldn't live with. He was the kind of man, you see, Herr Strobe, who would pick his own way to die." There was a moment's silence. "My husband hanged himself last night in the basement of this building. He paid the price, Herr Strobe, but he preferred his own form of currency." Her lips trembled. There was grief there in the face, an unutterable, unspeakable grief, but Strobe could not grasp what she was saying. There was, he decided, a joke going on, a joke that eluded him. The woman was obviously not speaking literally. This was the meat-cleaver heavy wit, so very Prussian, that her husband had probably taught her. Frau Gruber, he said. Frau Gruber, I'm afraid I don't understand. Don't you? She asked him. Are you stupid, Herr Strobe? It's really quite simple. My husband came home last night from the Rathskeller. We talked for an hour or so, then he left the house, supposedly to take a walk. I never saw him again, alive. Strobe exhaled, but breath was all that could come out, not words, not language. But you should feel complimented, Herr Strobe. His last thoughts were of you. Of me, Strobe said dumbly. Of me? Of you, she answered. He said that when he looked at you, it was as if he were looking at a machine that he had built, that he had designed and planned and created. He said that there were normally decent Germans who had created a monster, but that the real crime came in that the monster was not created in their image, but the other way around. It was the monster who usurped and corrupted until it reached a point where Germany became a nation of monsters. She closed her eyes. Strobe saw the tears on her face. He stared at her. So much death, he thought, so much death over a period of a few hours. Lancer, Gruber, the Pole, and each with a confessional, a few bon mots to salvage the soul, to justify, to excuse, to expiate. My God, Frau Gruber, he whispered. I didn't know. I simply didn't know. Then, with his stomach feeling ice-cold, while the rest of him burned in fire, he shook his head back and forth. What shall I do? He asked her. What shall I do? I thought he might help me. They had connections, he said. He had friends or relatives or someone who could change his passport. I came here tonight to beg him, to plead with him, to help me. He noticed then that the woman had stopped crying. She was staring at him again, and her mouth looked crooked, and she had grown very pale. Herr Strobe, she said, her voice soft, he has already helped you, though you may not understand it. He has shown you the way. He has demonstrated to you that there is a moment when life simply runs out. No! Strobe roared at her. There is no such point. No one willingly takes on death. That's crazy. That's insane. You must clutch at life. You must take it to you. You must hold on to it, covet it, protect it. It is all there is. He stood there, shaking, sweating, his eyes pleading for understanding. I see, the woman said, almost in a whisper. It is life that is so sweet, life that is so precious. Exactly, he said to her, exactly that. Then tell me, Herr Strobe, as to the Jews and all the others whose lives you took. What about them? What about their lives? Strobe wanted to claw at his head, to let his thoughts out. Phrases stuck together. Ideas seemed glued to the inside of him. The Jews, the others, but you don't understand. You simply don't understand. They had no right to survive, and there was no alternative. We had no other choice. It was either them or us. You understand that, don't you? Them or us?" The woman nodded. "Them or us," she repeated. Why, it's arithmetical, isn't it, Herr Strobe? It's an equation of a sort, isn't it? Them or us?" "That's it," Strobe said eagerly. "That's what it comes down to." "What a pity," the woman said. "What a pity my husband never understood this. It was his feeling, Herr Strobe, that he had run out on his faith, that he had betrayed it." "Faith?" Strobe clutched at the word and shouted it aloud. "Faith, indeed! That's what I'm talking about, Frau Gruber. I'm talking about faith. We had a faith, you see. It is what we believed in. Germany was a faith. The Führer was a faith. Our destiny was a faith." "I see," she whispered to him. "Why, Herr Strobe, you've done yourself an injustice. You should have explained that to me. You should have explained it to my husband, too. Why, you've not credited yourself properly. You've been misjudged. You had no particular passion for killing, did you? That's obvious now. Killing was, well, it was a faith, wasn't it? A religion. And the crematoriums, they were shrines, weren't they? And the gas ovens, temples of worship. And the slaughter of children, this was just some kind of ceremonial, wasn't it? A sacrament. And here all along I thought your kind dealt in butchery. Nothing of the sort, Herr Strobe. A religion, a faith. That's what it was." Why, Strobe realized suddenly, this woman hates me. She despises me. See how she backs away from me? How she inches off? As if recoiling? Actually recoiling? I've said the wrong things to you, Frau Gruber," he said. "You mourn your husband, and here I come into your home when you would rather be alone." It was not really what he wanted to say, but at the moment he did not know what to say. He only knew he couldn't let this woman escape. Somehow, some way, he had to capture her goodwill, appeal to her, make her sympathize with him. "You see, Frau Gruber, your husband needed understanding. One reaches for understanding." "Is that what you're looking for?" The woman's voice sounded suddenly harsh. "Understanding?" "Something of the sort," Strobe said, feeling the awful urge to cry. "I've been hunted like an animal. At this moment, I swear to you, like your husband, I am being hunted just like an animal." He blinked back his tears. "But I am not an animal. I am no animal." Frau Gruber was silent for a long moment. Then she walked closer to him, her eyes never leaving him. "Of course you're no animal, Herr Strobe," she said. "An animal takes no joy in killing, nor does it ever feel the urgent necessity to explain its killing. If you were an animal, Herr Strobe, I might offer you the understanding you seek." With the sudden, selective clarity of alcohol, Strobe saw her lips twitch, and he heard her voice for the first time sound high and unsteady, almost uncontrolled. "What you are, Herr Strobe, is quite another thing from an animal. You are a pervert. You are a butcher of 6 million people, but you are no human being either. A human being could not fill so many graves, and think of it as an offense that might be apologized for, like a belch after a meal, or picking one's nose at the opera. What you have done to this earth, Herr Strobe, is not an offense. It is a mortal sin that even God cannot forgive. But that you walk the streets and others like you, this is a sin I attribute to God, something that I can't forgive him for." Strobe kept shaking his head back and forth, mentally putting up his hands, trying to ward her off, trying to shut out her words. "Frau Gruber," he said, "please, please." She was so close to him now, less than a hand's length away, that their faces were almost touching. An insane woman, really. An insane woman. "Herr Strobe," she whispered at him, "do you want to hear a really monstrous thing? Do you want to know how sick with guilt this poor dead husband of mine really was? He married a Jewess. He actually married a Jewess. This corrupt, strutting Prussian who was dying of sadness and dying of regrets and dying from all the guilt that choked him. But even more monstrous, Herr Strobe, even more unbearable." Her voice trailed off into what sounded like a sob. "I loved him." Speech came back to her. "A Jewess loved him. God help me. God forgive me. I loved him." Not real, Strobe thought. Not real at all. This was fantasy, mere fantasy. She's just saying these things. She's still trying to confuse me. "Now leave me, Herr Strobe." Her voice was suddenly ice cold. "I have much mourning ahead of me. I have to mourn my husband's death, and also his life. I have to mourn his guilt, in addition to my own." Her eyes had closed. Now she opened them and stared at him. "But this one last thing, Herr Strobe." She advanced on him, and Strobe backed against the wall, stumbling over his feet, looking at this white-stricken face that exuded such hate. "Before you leave, Herr Strobe," she said, following him, "before you leave, this little sign of an affection that you seem to crave, this little gesture of love, a kiss for you, Herr Strobe. May it be the first of many." The flat of her hand smashed against his cheek. The nails left a gouged furrow as the hand went past him, and then he found himself out in the corridor. The door slammed in his face, the echo of it reverberating through the corridor. Automatically he turned and walked toward the elevator, and automatically, unthinking, unsinging, he pushed the button. And with his mind still numb, he found himself down on the sidewalk. Again his lungs, like bellows, wheezed and sent out streams of sporadic pain. Cars went back and forth. Any moment, one of them might stop. He ran down the sidewalk, thinking of the woman, seeing the look of ice-cold rage, stronger than her mourning, deeper than her grief. This was the crime of the Jew, that they could still show fury, that they could be trampled into the earth, their flesh burned away, that they could leave nothing behind but gold fillings and the smell of smoke. But somehow, some way, they survived. They always survived. They came at you in the dead of night, or enticed you in their apartments, chaperoned by the ghosts of dead Aryan husbands. Zamorsky, Strobe wanted to scream up into the night sky. Zamorsky, he wanted to say, you were wrong. I have paid. I am paying now. You people are still collecting the debt of 15 years. You are tearing chunks out of my body and chunks out of my brain. Zamorsky, in the name of the Jew Christ, close the ledger book. Close it, please. You have been paid in full. Nightmare. Walking and running and hiding. A newscast from a radio in an open window. The body of Vladislav Zamorsky, no known address, found strangled in a hotel room. Police seek link with previous night's murder of saloon owner Karl Lenzer. And there was a picture of Zamorsky on a television set in an appliance store window. Zamorsky, as seen in the frozen white light of a coroner's flashbulb. At last the world had taken note of Zamorsky, the Pole. It had found out his first name and acknowledged it on television. It had given him a shot of formaldehyde without charge and an accommodation on a slab, along with a case number in a police file. And wheels had been set in motion to find out who it was that had choked the life out of him. The sad and ugly little irony of Zamorsky the Pole had to die to achieve an identity and a first name and someone to care. During his wretched and tortured life, no one had even said a prayer for him, and there he was, in the unkind flash of a camera bulb, laying claim in death to the single legacy he had been denied in life, the simple acknowledgement that he was a human being. More nightmare. Strobe running and running and running, and seeing the face of Zamorsky reflected in every store window, a dark and one-eyed Caliban, a Polish cyclops, and even as he ran, Strobe saw the new irony. Now he was running from the police. There were new hunters. Every prowl car that drove by might suddenly stop, and a spotlight whirl toward him, seek him out in the darkness, pinion him in a stab of light. A new crime to pay for. One man, one lousy Pole, added to the list, the 10,000 name list. Put it on top of the mountainous pile of names, the funeral pyre built so long ago. And maybe this one name, maybe this one thin, bloodless skeleton would make the column topple, would bring the whole structure crashing down. More sidewalks, more blocks, more shadowed buildings. The black sedan not visible now but someplace, and still the running. Avert the faces of other people. His own face might be known by now. Hide. Hide first in a park by a bench. No good there. Police patrol the parks hourly. Movie house possibility. Thrown away. Too public. Might be seen in the lobby. Bus. Take a bus. No good either. Getting late. Not many people riding. Easily picked out. There is the seaweed floating by. There is the slender straw. This way to salvation. Use this exit out of hell. And Strobe knew. The art museum. The picture with him in the rowboat. The eternity of peace. Immortality in a rowboat on a mountain lake. I, Joseph Strobe, do hereby resign from the human race effective immediately. I resign from my running in shadows. I resign from lying on my mattress and painting nightmares on the ceiling. I resign from Gruber's guilt and Lancer's blood-splattered naivete, and I resign from the Lord's vengeance. But another act of the nightmare. 2 blocks from the art museum, he saw the black sedan again. Its lights were on. It was moving slowly down the street toward him, and then it pulled up to a curb and stopped. 2 men got out from the front seat and started to walk toward him. Not Brazilian brush salesmen, not American tourists waiting for their wives, not policemen either. 2 men in dark suits. One walked toward him on the sidewalk. The other crossed the street diagonally, then stood waiting on the opposite curb. There was something in his hand. It glinted in the street light. More Jews with teeth, and with a capacity for fury, and with memories. Strobe turned and ran. He could hear the footsteps of the men behind him keeping pace. He turned the corner, hesitating for a moment, then started down a side street. The footsteps were getting closer. Into the back parking lot of a building, a truck was just moving away from a loading platform. He stumbled, fell, unconscious of pain or of the fact that he could barely breathe, or that his body was a gushing fountain of sweat and filth. He was momentarily hidden by the departing truck, and used that moment to fling himself onto the loading platform and through an open door into the building. Up metal stairs to a second floor, he heard the voices of the two men down below. There were footsteps across the macadam of the parking lot. One man was going around to the front. There were other footsteps starting up the metal stairs behind him. Second floor fire door, locked. He pulled and pushed, strained, pounded with his fists. The footsteps were almost up to him. Up another flight, his legs like concrete, no longer flesh and blood, but more like extensions of himself that went through the motions of obeying him. Street level, third floor, this door open. He pushed his way through and entered a total darkness. But now he knew where he was. The art museum. A miracle, like the Red Sea opening. He had made it. There were the dim outlines of paintings on the walls. There were shadowy statues in the corners. He ran down the middle of the room toward another distant door, hearing the one behind him open as his pursuers joined him in the darkness. His head brushed something that swung away from him. He remembered. The mobile. He was in the room. He was in the very room. He stumbled and reached out to hold himself from falling. One hand grazed a statue. His head hit the metal pedestal, and even the pain seemed unrelated to him. The footsteps of the man ran past him, then stopped, then started running again. First to one side, then the other, to a far corner, then a near one. The footsteps continued, first loud, then softer, nearer, then farther away, playing hide and seek with him in the darkness. But it was only a question of time. He knew he could neither fight nor defend himself. He had run out of strength. He was the animal at the end of the hunt, surrounded, enclosed, exhausted, and soon to be caged. But this could not be the end. He willed that it would not be the end. Some intuitive, blind, and impulsive thing inside of him guided him and strengthened him, and for a reason. As the footsteps moved back and forth, getting closer, Strobe looked across from his shadowed lair to the indistinct frame of a picture across the room. Fisherman, boat, mountain, lake, peace. I have nothing left. I am emptied. I am some stale breath left over from a death rattle. I have known hell. Whatever I owed, I paid. Please, please, let me have my peace now. Let me back into the picture. He closed his eyes, and while the footsteps grew closer and the figure of the man became discernible, hovering over him, staring down at him, he forced himself through some mystic resolve, some incredible will born of the last shred of desperation's strength, to disappear from the room and from the earth. He moved quietly and unobserved into a painting. The assistant curator looked sleepily at his watch, then toward the night watchman who sucked noisily on an unlighted pipe. "It's 2 o'clock in the morning," the assistant curator said irritably. He gazed down the length of paintings, took a few steps off to one side to look behind a pillar toward some statuary, and then returned to stand near the night watchman. "There are noises," the night watchman said defensively. "I heard them very plainly. Footsteps, men running up and down the back stairs." The assistant curator rubbed his beard stubble and nodded sleepily with bored eyes. "I'm not saying you didn't hear voices, Pablo," he said for the 5th or 6th time that night. "I'm simply saying that whoever was here is no longer here, and whoever was here did no damage." The night watchman pointed toward the base of one of the statues. "What about the blood on the floor?" The assistant curator shrugged. "Whoever was here tripped and fell." He pointed to the statue. "Bumped his head." He shrugged again, then took a slow walk over to the light switch panel near the main entrance of the room. He flicked off the lights. The night watchman's flashlight threw out a pale yellow ray that played over the various pictures. He walked toward the assistant curator, switching off the flashlight, and then abruptly turning it on again to let the light play against the far wall. "What's the matter?" the assistant curator asked. "Still hearing noises? Didn't you hear that one?" The assistant curator listened. There had been a noise, nothing distinct, a very distant cry, the cry of an animal, or the cry of someone in terrible pain. He frowned and flicked on the light switch again to look down the expanse of the room. He listened again. There was no further sound. He turned to the night watchman. "Dog or something. Must have been run over." The night watchman nodded, but was unconvinced. "I've been hearing it for the last hour. A cry of some kind." The assistant curator nodded, absent-mindedly, then looked toward a blank space on the wall. He pointed to it. "What happened to the concentration camp thing? Was that one of those sent out tonight?" The night watchman shook his head. "Nope, he just moved it over there." He pointed across the room to the far wall. "The fisherman is on loan out. The director told me to put the concentration camp thing in its place." The assistant curator looked toward the painting of the man, arms outstretched on the cross. Hateful-looking thing. He'd never liked it. But it was odd about the picture. Much of its detail seemed to become evident only after one observed it for a period of time. For example, he thought, walking over toward the painting, he had never noticed the face of the victim on the canvas, or the fact that he was a heavy-set porcine man with a naked skull and blue eyes. Yes, you could actually see the blue eyes, open wide and with such a look of agony and such a look of terror frozen there in paint, but incredibly alive-looking. He shuddered and almost winced as he turned away from the painting. Really an ugly thing, a disturbing thing. Why, in God's name, did some artist persist in dredging up aged horrors like that? He motioned to the night watchman ahead of him and flicked off the light switch. As the two men left the room, each one thought he heard, but neither mentioned, the persistent, thin cry that arose from the darkened room behind them. The assistant curator went home. The night watchman brewed himself a hot cup of coffee, and two Israelis drove slowly through the dark streets back to their hotel, neither of them speaking, but one of them thinking over and over again, "A man can't just disappear. He simply just can't disappear." And former Gruppenführer Strobe hung on a cross, screaming, constantly screaming, perpetually screaming. And he would never again stop. This has been The Escape Route, written by Rod Serling, This is Scott McDonald. Thank you for listening.